So let's get started. Looks like our technical challenges have all been met. So I'm Kenny, and I am happy to be your trainer this morning. And so I'm a board member of Tides. I also work with Coastal Horizons. I work part-time now. I'm kind of like in semi-retirement. We'll see how that goes. And spent many of years in a leadership role, but like doing trainings like we're about to do this morning. So I hope it's very important that it doesn't matter that your supervisor is here. It doesn't matter that the camera's on. None of that matters. What matters is that we have a real good conversation around the topics that we're going to talk about today. Basically, this is like a full day training, but we're going to condense it to about 3.5 hours, and we'll be done by 12:30. We'll also have some little intermissions, some breaks, and I'll try to break it up by sections. So, our objectives today are really 4, and we're going to cover 4 topics. And you have the handouts here, so don't feel, of course, take notes as you want to, but everything really is there. Plus you'll have access to this in the future as well. So really we're going to talk about 4 things today. The first thing is about privacy, which really is covered under HIPAA and confidentiality. And hopefully we'll talk about it in some ways maybe that you haven't heard before, but we'll get into conversation with that. The second part will be about substance use disorders, opioid use disorder, kind of zoom in on that, as well as some treatment approaches and things that I think are important to understand for folks working with Tides patients or women. The third is going to be talking about trauma and a little bit about what a trauma focused approach involves. And then the fourth, which is going to be a little bit of a concluding mishmash, because we're really going to talk about these things throughout, but about stigma, about how we have healthy conversations with and about folks who are in a program, and then really kind of end with the ideas of what good customer service looks like, how to take those principles of good customer service and make them work in this setting. So, and that's been one of my passions. As a matter of fact, next week I'm presenting at a conference just on customer service for behavioral health professionals, because I think it's a lost art. I think we get so used to people in their drama and their behavior that we lose sight of what great customer service is that makes us happy to be somewhere. And we're going to talk about kind of maybe rejuvenating some of that approach. And I believe it makes a huge difference in the outcomes of how people respond to care. So anyway, that's what we're going to jump in with. Questions, comments, you don't have to wait to a section. I might pause every once in a while if you guys are too quiet. I might say, okay, the room's too quiet. I'm the only voice I'm hearing. I need to hear some other voices. But first thing to understand is that HIPAA, everyone knows what HIPAA is, right? HIPAA is what you sign all these forms. HIPAA has to do with privacy and protection of your medical record. And it really has to do with records. HIPAA was really about your health information, and what it stands for, like Health Information Portability, kind of Accountability Act, something like that. But it's really about not transferring information unless you have given permission for that. So every time you go to a medical office, what are you signing? A HIPAA form. But you're in a field that is both HIPAA, and it's very important to understand the other aspects of confidentiality for someone who's receiving treatment for substance use disorder. Because in the 1960s, there was this other thing, and you see it there, 42 CFR Part 2. You're thinking, what is that? Well, it stands for the Code of Federal Regulations, and North Carolina has similar kind of state components to that protects people who are receiving treatment for substance use disorders from any unauthorized disclosure unless they give prior informed written permission. So we're going to talk about that a little bit because we know about HIPAA, but we sometimes probably inadvertently are in violation of the intention of what 42 CFR Part 2. So I cut my teeth as a counselor. The first thing you learn is you can't talk about somebody to somebody else. It's kind of like that's the basic rule. It includes what goes on in here, stays in here, but it also even means if somebody, I'll give you an example of how confidential. Somebody calls me and tells me their daughter is having a substance use problem, and they want to talk about it. I say, okay. And they'd like to get their daughter in treatment. And I remind them, I say, if your daughter walks in the door, whether it's the virtual door or whether it's a in-person door, I will not be able to tell you anything about what happened. I won't even be able to tell you that she walked in the door. Because once she walks in the door, that is protected now information by 42 CFR Part 2. So I say, so, if your daughter is willing for me to talk with you, she's going to have to sign a written consent form that's specific. That says, I, whatever the name is, authorize this person to disclose to this person the following types of information. It's very specific, and keep in mind why it came into being to begin with. It came into being to begin with because of stigma and discrimination. So it was to protect a person, to be able to talk about, get help for things related to substance use without being subject to other kinds of penalties. So it protects the privacy. Even if a police officer walks in and says, I'm here and I need the information on so-and-so, we won't be able to give that police officer that information without a signed written, or, and I'll talk about the exceptions, there are some legal exceptions to that. And I'm going to kind of share those with you. So HIPAA is one thing. It's basically controlling the airwaves of the medical information. Confidentiality is deeper. It's our promise to protect the privacy of the person who walks through our door and asks for help. It's not to disrespect other people who might have a need to know. We work on the way to make that happen legally and ethically. But it's my bond to you that I'm going to protect your privacy. That means that you can tell me what's going on and you don't have to worry about me picking up the phone and calling someone who will let you told. Okay, so that's the basis of that. This right here is a form that's up on the screen that we use at Coastal Horizon Center. Yes, Debbie?
I have a question in regards to our staff speaking with each other.
Right.
About a resident's information that would otherwise be protected for someone on the outside.
And that's such a great question. Staff to staff communication. Let's give an example. Staff to staff communication, when the entire staff has agreed to confidentiality like what this is, you're all binding yourselves ethically and legally to protect the privacy. Within that staff, you're allowed to communicate with each other. Communications are acceptable. However, there are ways that even that can be violated. And I'll tell you an example how. I'm going to work on names. Deb, Courtney. Can I use you two for example? All right. So Deb tells Courtney that she's working with, I'll use my sister's name, Susie. She's working with Susie on her treatment. Courtney, however, knows Susie from another relationship. And Courtney is curious about what's going on with Susie because it might impact, because maybe Susie was dating your brother. I know nothing about this, so all right. So just an example. If Courtney goes and looks up private information about client Susie or patient Susie because she wants to know what's going on with the relationship with her brother, she's violated confidentiality. However, if Courtney and Deb talk about Susie pertaining to the treatment that is going on here, that's protected. Because you've all promised to protect the privacy. You follow what I'm saying? There's an ethical obligation to share information with each other only for the purposes of bettering the individual and pertaining to their treatment and their work here. So if it was at Coastal, I would say it's pertaining to their treatment at Coastal Horizons. Here it would be pertaining to their participation at Tides Successful. Yes?
I have a question. So we get like probation officers, DSS, parents, friends, boyfriend, people, not boyfriends, but other people in these women's lives.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do when we have, say, someone in the office that is a resident and then the social worker come or probation come or, whatever? How do we
communicate? How do we communicate? What can we say? What can we not say?
To get them to say, like, we have someone in the office, or how does that work?
Yeah, so the idea is that each individual has the right to give consent and authorization to communicate. If I'm here in treatment and I've been mandated by probation, I'm going to sign a consent for certain information to be given to probation. Why? Because I want to comply with probation. If I'm here because my employer requires me to be here, I'm going to sign a consent to my employer so you can talk to my employer. So-and-so is doing really well. And I'll also detail the things that can be shared. Like, I might not want to share my sexual assault history with my PO or my employer because it's none of their business. But they might need to know drug tests, participation in the program, or an assessment of how their recovery is going. So even though I consent to information, there might be some things that are sensitive that others don't need to know. So there has to be the consenting process. I know it's a technical thing, but it's a deeply respectful, personal thing. So each of those entities that you talk about, whether it's a boyfriend, a family member, a PO, a social worker, each of those should have the consenting process should be very clear of what this particular client, this woman at Tides, is giving authorization for conversations about her outside of her work here.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
None of that can be shared with another resident in the room.
Right, but
You have to simply ask them to step out so that you can speak to the PO office.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that is a private conversation because
that was
And not even within earshot.
okay.
So like if you've got someone that's, running around in the halls or something like that, it's not enough to say, could you step into your bedroom?
Yeah,
Because they're within walls.
And we're talking about ethics and legal, but we're really talking about how we would want to be treated.
Right.
You wouldn't want somebody to talk about your information most of the time in front of other people if it was private or personal. So yes, the proper procedure would be, let's go to a place where we can talk privately and we can talk about what's going on.
Okay.
And that would be out of the earshot, out of the purview of other clients.
Okay.
So my question is kind of like a reversal of that situation.
Okay.
Say if, like, for me, I know I've known residents personally outside before I've worked here. So, but that affects how I might approach them here. Where does that type of information fall?
Oh, that's so good because I live in downtown Wilmington and I've had clients who are like live a block away from me and they'll see me. I had one guy in the mall who yelled out to me, "Kenny House, I need to come do a drug test with you." I mean, everybody heard. The entire mall heard. He shouted it. You know? Now, he can do whatever he wants. I'm bound, however. I didn't say, sure, come on down. You know, I didn't acknowledge. I might, at a later time, when I meet with him, say, look, you know, I couldn't respond to that because of privacy and protecting your privacy. Even though you didn't seem to care about your privacy, I do as a professional. And as someone, it's another way of saying, I'm going to keep my promises with you. My promise is to protect your privacy in all the ways that you expect it and that we expect it as professionals. And it's a bonding thing. It says, oh, you really are. You're not interested in blabbing about me. You're interested in protecting me. It's a protective measure that should it should be done in a way that increases the bond between you and the client.
Let me piggyback on that for Gabby's situation. We definitely have women that have crossed paths with our graduates that are on staff. It cannot change the way we approach them, the things we say to them. We should not be discussing the old days, old battle wounds and scars and things that may have happened in the past. It's got to stay on that professional level.
Which means that I'm going to be more limited in what I can say than the other individual, because that other individual may not feel that constraint, and she might want to tell you the world, you know, everything in the world, but you're going to have to maintain, you know, things like that's good. I'm glad to hear that. It's like affirming, not this, sorry, I can't talk about, you know, not this cold, but I'm glad to hear that. That's good. Hey, let me know if you ever want to talk sometime. You know, again, you're keeping the rapport that you built, but you're maintaining the professional boundary at the same time. And it is an art, especially when people will just blurt out everything. Like the guy at the mall or somebody that wants to tell you the whole world what's going on in the neighborhood. And you'd love to jump in. Oh yeah, and she did, you know, but you got to realize, no, even if I'm not in the office, I'm a professional, which means I have to limit what I say to not say. And that happens to me in the neighborhood sometimes. People want to have treatment conversations with me on the street. Okay, you can tell me anything you want. And I'll let you know that I still care about you. I won't act like I'm stuck up because I'm a pro kind of thing. I'll still be there with you, but I maintain that boundary. I always maintain that boundary.
That kind of sort of answered my question, but we have a lot of women here that share their medical history, their prescription history, their whatever, and I will a lot of the time say, let's talk somewhere else, or I'll try to at least, but then they just keep, it's like they don't mind everyone else knowing what medicines they're on or whatever.
Sure.
What do we do in that type of situation?
Well, I would continue to reinforce exactly what you said. Hey, maybe we should talk about that privately. But again, an individual can disclose about themselves whatever they want.
Okay.
There's nothing being violated. But once you respond with professional kind of like, if you engage furthering that conversation, then you've hit your limit there.
So we just said we'll talk later, or
we can talk
privately
later about that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm glad. You can even say, I'm glad you're telling me about that. But let's talk later about that.
Okay.
You know, it's affirming. It's still privacy, but it's still bonding. I'm not acting stuck up or you know, too aloof. But I'm also reaffirming the privacy issue.
Okay.
Very important. So all of you signed some kind of form. Debbie may be revising some of these forms. We talked about that.
After last Monday, I'm like, oh, I gotta do some new forms.
But you all agree to this, and then and I'll skip over this. But just to know that there are all kinds of protective actions that you take as a professional, and at least for me, I don't know how it works for you, but for me, there are penalties. There are legal penalties if someone wants to sue me because I violated their privacy. And let me just tell you this, do not be seduced by someone being so sweet, thinking that if you violate their privacy, that when things aren't so happy, that you might not be challenged legally for that. It can start sweet, but when things go sour somewhere else, someone's going to come back and say, yeah, but Kenny violated my privacy. I have got to protect, myself, my license, my professionalism. So sweetness doesn't cut it for me. I don't care how sweet you are and how close you think we are. I know that if things go south, you might take me south with you.
And that does happen, especially here.
Yeah, so be aware of that. Now, 42 CFR does have some exceptions. But any disclosure that's tied to an exception, and these are a few examples, there's more, but these are the ones that I think have come up the most in my experience. One is a medical emergency. If someone's in a medical emergency, they don't have time to sign a consent and even know what's going on. So if a doctor or a medical professional needs to know what medications they're on, now they don't need to know their sexual assault history, okay? Or what happened as a child between their parents of being abused as a child. They don't need to know that. But they do need to know whatever's necessary to attend to the medical emergency. So I override confidentiality in a medical emergency, but I limit the information that's necessary with it. Does that make sense? So you have to think, it doesn't mean it's an open book. You can't hand over their entire record with everything in there. You give the information that's necessary. Because it's geared at helping the individual. In this, crimes against programmer staff. So here's how I usually explain it. You can't try to run me off the road and then say, but you can't tell anybody because I'm a patient at Crystal Rocks or a type. In other words, once somebody commits a crime, not a crime generally, but a crime against a staff person or against the premises, you're allowed to do whatever's necessary in giving the report and information to the police for them to apprehend and build that case against that individual. They're not protected with their privacy. Again, that doesn't mean that you need to talk about that they were abused as a child. That is not really part of a criminal investigation usually when it comes to burning down an apartment or attacking a staff person. But you can't hit and then hide. You can't hit me in the face and then hide behind confidentiality. So, and these are legal exceptions. Another one is a court order from a judge. And I want to be really clear on this. This is not a subpoena. Actually, 42 CFR, we don't release any information from a subpoena. Even if I'm subpoenaed into court, I've gone into court before with the record. And I'll be asked information from the record. And if it's sensitive information, I'll turn to the judge and I'll say, Your Honor, I request to give this information in closed chambers. Because there might be people in this courtroom who have no business hearing what you're about to hear. And the judge will almost always grant that. But outside of that, a court order from a judge, that's when a judge, not a subpoena, a judge orders in writing divulging of certain information. And in that case, we comply with the judge's court order. Or will be found in contempt. Yes, Rosie.
I have a question. So, we get a lot of this, but sometimes, unfortunately, the ladies are no longer with us and a family member reaches out to us saying, have you heard about her? She was in your program. Can you tell me anything about that? And they are in the consent to share information. They are signed that we are allowed to provide information. Now, is that just health related, or can we actually say she's no longer in the program?
It should be detailed in the consent.
Okay.
So if the consent says one of the things that you can share with her family, for example, is participation in the program, you could say she's no longer in the program.
Gotcha. Okay.
So you really go back to the consent form
Mhm.
and make sure that what you're giving information about is clear in the consent, that it's allowable.
Gotcha.
That's the key.
So a
thing.
person could say, don't divulge anything about me to such and such ever.
Well, they don't
Correct.
have to say that
Okay.
because that means they haven't signed a consent. In other words,
Okay.
the rule is always no information can be given. That's the basic rule of confidentiality. Anything outside of that, they sign a written consent. And here's another thing: you can't do it verbally. You can,
Really?
by law, you can verbally revoke
I
a
did not know
consent.
that.
You can verbally revoke a consent, but you cannot verbally give consent. It has to be in writing.
So if we have a lady, for example, if we have a lady here whose mom is on the phone with her, and she says, my mom wants to talk to you and wants to know about how I'm doing in the program, what do I do in that situation?
That's great. I have had that happen.
It
And
happens a lot
and I've
here.
said, well, we don't have a consent for your mom right now.
Mhm.
So what we'll need to do is get you to sign a consent, and then we'll be happy to share with your mom whatever would be helpful that you want to give permission.
So if
for.
they have a consent form and it isn't specific about what we can share and what we can't share, is that like a general, we can share whatever they?
That's actually not a valid consent form.
Oh.
The consent
Right.
form, part of the consent form is not only who you
That
can talk
that's
to,
the form we're redoing.
Okay, gotcha.
but it also has to specify the type of things that can be shared.
Okay.
Program participation, drug testing results, and then whatever else. Some people want to share. I want to share. I want everything. I want this person to know everything. So then you can put anything contained in my record.
That would be super helpful for us to have like a.
Yeah, but it needs to specify what kinds of things. Now, some people try to be cute with that. So someone says, well, I want you to share my drug test results with my mom for February, April, and June, not March or May.
Lord, I
In
can
other
feel
words,
that, yeah.
and usually what I would say if somebody wanted to manipulate that, I'd say, ethically, I really can't do that because I would be misleading by giving that kind of.
Correct.
But you can specify, and there have been times that people have tried to, all right, I'm going to consent, and then they know they're going to present a drug test that's going to have another drug in it, and they say, I'm revoking my consent. And they can. But if they revoke their consent, I then will notify whoever they gave the consent to and can say, I just want you to know we no longer have a consent to discuss this.
Can they verbally revoke their consent? Or
Yes.
Do they have to, okay.
They can verbally revoke, but they can't verbally consent.
Okay.
It has to be in writing, clear, with all the steps for it to be a valid consent. What we usually do, and there are a couple different strategies, but to make sure that, let's say that you're working, Rosie, with someone and there's a consent, and then that person verbally revokes it. How does Courtney know that? So you have to have a system as a team
Yes.
that, okay, we're going to check that consent. What we would do is on the consent, we would write a big, O on top of it, revoked, and as of the date and initial it, or you put it in a progress note too. Or if I know that Courtney also is working with that person, I might just let Courtney know. Courtney, you need to know that Susie just revoked her consent. So when mom calls you, there's no longer a consent in place. And what you can say, you can't say anything. You can say that consent has been revoked. That's the only thing really you can say. Or the other way to put it is, we no longer have consent or authorization to share information with you. Oh, what does that mean? And then I usually say, I can't tell you about Susie, but let me tell you generally what this means. And I can talk about the protocols. It means that unless a person signs a written consent, I can't share that information. And if that person revoked it, maybe they have a reason for that, and maybe you should explore that with them.
Yeah.
Yes.
If a woman is just mad right now, she's downstairs, she's talking to the residential manager, and she's like, I don't want you talking to my mom. Is that revoking? Or do we need to stop at that point and say, okay, I'm gonna need you to be clear with me, are you telling me that
Yeah.
you're revoking your consent?
I think I would want to be clear, because I wouldn't want a statement that somebody said flippantly
Right,
to then get documented in a chart as a revocation. Say, well, look, we have a consent to talk with your mom. If you want to revoke that consent, we can do that and take that consent and revoke it, and then we have to notify your mom that there's no longer consent in place.
Okay.
And that's the professional way to do it. Because somebody said, I don't want you talking to anybody, they walk out of the room. I'd later get back to the person and just say, hey, let's just talk about this because we have the consent in place. I want you to think about this, because sometimes there are consequences when they revoke consent, even though they're angry. Just like anybody, you do something in anger and then later you think, that wasn't a good idea. Revoke consent to an employer, you might lose your job. To your mom, you might, feel that you're not going to have a place to stay when you leave the Tides place, or you revoke to your PO, you might be doing jail time or whatever. So sometimes you say something in anger or frustration, and then I'd come back and say, I wouldn't say, oh no, it's like, okay, let's come back and talk about that and make sure we're clear on that. I wouldn't wait a lot of time, because that individual might say, I revoked my consent. I wait a few minutes, but I get to that person pretty soon and say, I need to know officially so that we can document this, whether you're revoking your consent. Because that's a serious thing. And remember, you giving consent we took very seriously, because your privacy is really important to us. So even though the patient might be mad and angry and frustrated and whatever, you're still affirming that your commitment to their privacy is number one.
Is there like a limit on how often they can do back and forth? I want you to, I don't want you to.
There is
I can
none.
see that happening.
Oh, I have. No, we had one person over at Coastal just in the last few years that was signing, revoking like crazy. And basically, for us, it was a counseling issue to try to get them to just understand and make a longer term decision. And basically, we knew that they were just in this kind of ping pong with their family, good days, bad days.
Yep.
And it can get exhausting, written consent, revoked consent, written consent. But we try to tell them, let's think about this long term, what your goals are, and see if we can help you with it from that way. So before we move, because the next move is we go over to talk about use disorders and treatment and recovery. Before we do that, think about privacy. Anything new that we talked about that you want to reflect on before we move on to the next section? All right, Gabby.
So you were saying, I understand the I guess the ethical issue with if they were saying I want this month released and not that month released, but would they legally be able to do that? Can if it's specified things that they can consent to be released, could they how detailed could that get potentially?
It can get a little dicey when people are trying to manipulate the consent process to keep them out of hot water with somebody. I draw the line at where I feel like that by giving information a certain way, I would be deceiving
So
the
it's
receiver of it.
personal to you, but
Yeah, and I would say, ethically, I'm not willing to do that, because I feel like I would be manipulating the information. So I'm not comfortable doing that. And, I would get a supervisor and say, am I looking at this wrong? I wouldn't make the decision by myself too.
Could
I
somebody
get
else
somebody
do
else to say, look, am I looking at this wrong? And oftentimes people would bring that to me as a supervisor, and I would say, no, you're looking at it right. You never want to give information in a way that you believe will be misleading. You want to give accurate and truthful information, not misleading information. And that's where I might draw the line. I might just say, I'm not willing to release your drug tests that work in your favor, but not release the ones that you don't want. I'm not willing to do that. I'm not comfortable with that as a professional. I'd say because it would come back on me that I misled whoever it was, the parent, the husband or wife, the employer, the PO, You know, in other words, I said, I can't do that as a professional. So you can draw a line. And then move forward with it. Hopefully you get the individual to think more long-term, more about what are your goals. You know, when you think about releasing information, people have goals. I want my family to be a part of my recovery. I want my PO off my back. I want freedom. You know, I want my employer to trust me so that I don't have to fear losing my job and be looked at and they're thinking, oh, that's just a drug addict, or whatever the case might be, or she's crazy, or whatever it might be, right? So I try to look at consenting and confidentiality and privacy to build rapport and focus on what are your real goals here so that we can help you get to where you really want to get to. So if they ask something crazy to me like that, I'll say, let's remember why we're doing the consent process. Let's talk about that all over again and what your goals are. Oh, okay. And then you reframe it. You help the person reframe it. So they do think more long term about why they're giving consent. What do they want to accomplish?
Are they gonna do are they supposed to do a detailed consent for every person? Like PO, DSS, mom, dad, sister, brother?
They really are.
Wow, okay.
We have consents. Now, the exception is if you can consent to an entity. So, for example, if the consent was between Tides and Coastal Horizons, it could just say Coastal Horizons.
Okay.
And then it would cover anybody who's under the Coastal Horizons privacy umbrella.
Okay.
But you couldn't do that with DSS would be a separate consent. Parole officer, probation officer would be a separate
Because they
consent.
might want different things.
Mom, oh, definitely.
Right.
Because I might want you to tell mom everything, but I might want you to tell PO my attendance and my drug test results, and that's it.
Right.
I don't want them knowing everything. I don't want them knowing my personal history, but I understand they need to know that I'm participating in the program, my attendance is good, my drug tests, are showing no evidence of other drug use or whatever it might be. I want that person to know this.
Okay.
Same with an employer.
Okay.
Usually people want an employer and the PO to know the same thing. But it's a little different with family. Because it's relational, it's more relational with family. It's more
Emotional.
Yeah. So it's more protective with. I want to protect myself from the PO and the employer knowing my business.
Sometimes it's protecting from family too.
That's right. Sometimes family has no idea of something. So that's why we talk about privacy. So so much. So anything else on privacy? And I call it confidentiality, but I really think about it more in the terms of the privacy piece. I think it gives us because I think about what we would want in different situations, and we would want the most privacy usually from the people that are working with us. So that's where we go with that. All right, we good on privacy? Good job. We got through section 1 of the 4 sections. So we go to disorders. So when we talk about substance use disorders, opioid use disorder, OUD being one of the substance use disorders and mental health disorders, we're talking about something that is diagnosed. Okay, so to say that somebody has a disorder is usually diagnosed by a professional who's licensed to make those diagnoses. Usually that happens. That doesn't mean that someone might come to you and say, they might say, I'm a cocaine addict. They might term what's going on with them. In a Coastal Horizons or another professional setting with diagnosing, we would diagnose and look through a set of criteria, which we're going to talk about a little bit, that would say this person basically registers the symptoms of a substance use disorder. So we start with what we called back in the day, we just referred to as addiction, but since then, addiction sometimes can have very stigmatizing, especially coming from an outsider, can have a stigmatizing kind of connotation to it. and you could say, well, everyone's addicted to something. Well, and that's kind of true, right? Everyone has something that no matter how many times you promise yourself you won't do, you do, or how many times you promise yourself you will do, you don't. So I mean, addiction, if you think about it broadly, is kind of it's a human condition. But when someone has a substance use disorder, there are certain things that have happened on a continuum that get to that place. And it's really better understood as a chronic brain disease. I'm going to break it down in a few minutes to just down to earth, but we didn't know that about addiction 50 years ago. 50 years ago, we thought about addiction more below the neck, meaning what it did to a person's body, withdrawal symptoms, those kinds of things, made them racy and jittery. The cocaine or the amphetamine effect, or the heroin or the depressant effect, alcohol, which is also a depressant, and those effects, those kinds of things. We thought about it. We didn't think as much about the brain. Starting in probably the early 90s, we understood from brain imagery, and I'll show you some pictures just for our fun, really showed us that the primary thing that was happening with people suffering from addiction was really happening in the brain. And so when you look at what's happening in the brain, we know that it changes the actual function and structure of the brain. And then there's a long process which we would call recovery, where the brain actually tries to repair itself and find a normal again. And that oftentimes is the process of which you find people at Tides or at other places. They're in the middle of that. They're right in the middle. They're not at the end of that or towards the end. They're not at the beginning. They're usually somewhere in the middle. It's expressed as compulsive behavior, meaning people do these behaviors over and over again. It's usually in a social context. But the thing about whether you think of it as just classic addiction or a substance use disorder, is that it's prone to what people would term as relapse or return to use, as is any chronic health condition. Diabetes, hypertension, asthma, they're all chronic health conditions that are prone to relapse. That's why they usually have medications as well as extreme behavior changes for people to manage it. Anyone who either has suffered from diabetes or has a loved one or a family member or a friend, you know that the behavior changes are crazy difficult. You got to change your diet, your rest, your exercise. You got to do things differently. That's why when I used to, I would talk with doctors. I would do trainings for the residents at the hospital. And anytime I asked the doctor this question, I got the same thing. It was so funny. I would say, who's your most difficult patient that frustrates you the most? They always told me it was their diabetes patients. Always. And then I asked why. And it was a very simple answer. And they all said it. They said, because they won't do what I tell them. Meaning the behavior change
It's so hard though.
is so hard. It's so hard. And yet for some reason, we understand that when mom has diabetes or someone, our friend, we comfort, we're there. Yeah, we don't stigmatize them. You don't introduce somebody and say, oh, this is my diabetic friend. And yet we do that with addiction or substance use disorders.
Gosh, that's crazy to think about it like that.
Yeah, it's a chronic health condition. It's prone to relapse. It's difficult. You gotta stop compulsive behaviors and think of how many times you made promises at New Year's Eve of what you were going to do different, and it lasted how long? 2 weeks? 3 weeks? And by February, were you at the gym?
I just didn't make promises at all. I just didn't make promises.
There you go. There you go. I'm not even going to make promises. I know better than to break my promises. But the cool thing is it's treatable. Like chronic health conditions, they're treatable, prone to relapse, and they require extreme behavioral change in order to recover. And so that's how we understand it. And I've talked to some recently, in the last few years, some medical kind of head guys are national. I'm on a national board for opioid addiction treatment, but these guys are starting to talk about the dysregulated brain. They said basically we're understanding what happens when someone develops a substance use disorder. Their brain becomes dysregulated. In other words, normal for the addicted brain is actually becomes abnormal. And I remember this from years ago because somebody did a story about his own journey from addiction to recovery, and he said he called it trying to find normal. In other words, that his for lack of a better term, his addicted self became a new normal. And he no longer knew what the old normal was.
Yeah.
And he was spending his energy trying to find the new normal, the old normal, to become his normal again. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's really, and this is where this concept of the dysregulated brain, there's tragedy, but there's also hope in that story. Because if you look on the right of this screen, you see a relatively happy, healthy brain, free of substance use for a year. But check this out for a second. During active substance use, the brain is developing all these holes on the left.
They're holes?
Yeah, I mean the brain is actually changing its form from drug use. Now, the cool thing is you would think, oh, well, that's never going to repair. You've done permanent damage. No. 1 year of substance use, look how healthy that brain looks. So we now know that the brain wants to repair itself. And if you give it the space, which we call early recovery, give it the space, the brain starts to repair itself.
So is that why, when I was first, it was really difficult for the first, 2 years, because I was just I was like a fish out of water.
Exactly.
And now I'm almost 6 years in, and so that means my brain has pretty much.
Your brain is
healed.
probably normalized. It's probably found its old normal new again.
Wow.
Now, here's the interesting thing. We see this on the camera of brains, but when you listen to people in recovery, what they always say is things like, I didn't feel normal again until about 1 or 2 years. Just like you just said, the 2 years. I didn't even ask you to say that. But that's exactly what the research is telling us when we look at people's brains.
My central nervous system was just shot. I mean, I was just on fight or flight mode all the time.
But isn't it crazy good that your brain worked to repair itself?
Yeah.
Like it didn't stay in that state. Now, things can happen to people that cause permanent brain damage, but addiction tends not to be that way. It tends to be, and I'm not going to say always, but it tends to be where the brain seeks to repair itself. Now, let me show you a few pictures. Normal brain. That's Rosie's brain.
Before.
That's
okay.
Rosie's brain right here.
Never had.
What do you think?
I
Courtney, is that your brain?
Yeah.
See? That's Courtney's brain. All right.
It's so pretty.
Oops.
Oh man.
20 years under the camera after heroin use.
Who had the
Are we
I hope
looking
Brenda
at the
didn't look at it.
dorsal or frontal view of the
Oh.
brain?
Probably the top.
I don't know. That's a good question. That's over my understanding of where they aimed the camera. 2 years of cocaine use. You see the damage that's already happening. It's in the brain.
Why is there a difference between the heroin and the cocaine?
Well, this was 2 years. I don't know what 20 years of
Oh,
cocaine use.
okay.
This was a snapshot. Look at this. 25
Wow.
years of alcohol use. Now, you see the holes at the top makes it look like a skeleton. You could almost draw.
What are the
picture.
colors? Do you know what the colors mean?
I don't.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I'm not the scientist. I just got the pictures,
It's
right?
really interesting.
But here's the other thing about that. Alcohol was the first drug that we understood did damage to the brain, and it was called Korsakoff syndrome or Swiss cheese, because scientists were starting to see holes in the brains of people that were drinking for many years. So we also know that yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we circle back really quick because something you guys pointed out, how long it takes to feel some normalizing in your life, because people expect it to happen
Just right away.
Yeah.
Oh, I know.
And I think it's really important to say, it does take time. I mean, that's not what people want to hear. People want to
It
hear.
takes a long
It's
time.
immediate.
It takes time,
Yeah,
it does.
and you should give the same patience in recovery from substance use disorder as you would to a diabetes patient or a hypertension patient or an asthma patient, because it's a chronic health condition. It's very similar. As a matter of fact, I could tell you the story of a diabetes patient and not say diabetes, and you wouldn't know what I was talking about, a substance use disorder or diabetes. You wouldn't be able to tell. And I've done that before. I said, let me tell you a story, and whatever, and they say, oh, you're talking about addiction. I said, no, I'm talking about diabetes.
You know what's crazy is that people, like my mom has diabetes, and growing up, I always just, my heart broke for her, but I feel like addiction is worse than anything they would ever get. We have the sickness that goes along with it, and it's, I mean, their brain chemistry doesn't change, I'm sure, like ours does. It's crazy how people treat the difference.
Yes.
It's different.
Yeah, and what we would do from a health perspective is find the commonality so that we would treat the person with the same respect and expectation. Sometimes I would say to my counselors that I supervise or the staff in a meeting, I say, we expect our substance use patients to behave better than you do. Like, you're setting expectations for them that you can't even follow.
Absolutely.
So sometimes we need to think about that. And marijuana too.
Gee.
So marijuana, some people think marijuana is just a psychological thing. No. It has direct effect on the brain and the immune system and some other things. Now, so let me tell you my story about substance use disorders and addiction so that you can just kind of bring it home. And you're free to share this story with anybody or any way you want to change it, because I made it up. So basically,
You made it up.
I made it up. So this is the Chef the Kitchen and the Home Cooked Meals. Who in this group has someone who cooks for you from time to time?
Gosh, I wish.
You do. All right. Are they a good cook? They are. And if you're on your way home and you call and that person says, I'm making you, what's your favorite dish that they make?
Sausage and rice.
Sausage and rice. And you find out that that person is making a sausage and rice dish for you, and you are exhausted, and you are frustrated. Wasn't a great day at work, okay? And let's say that the drive home is 20, 25 minutes, and you drive by a fast food joint, and you just can't wait. And you say, I know that food's waiting at home, but I need something right now. I just need something. I don't care, but we'll call it Hardee's this time. And so because you saw a big picture of it, like a burger or something. So you go through the drive-through, you get the burger, and of course you stuff yourself. And by the time you get home, you're really full. And you tell to this person who cooked for you, I am so sorry, but I just had a bad day and I couldn't help myself, and I went and got a big juicy burger from Hardee's, and they put fries on it because I didn't realize I was getting the combo, and all those things, and your stuff, and say, can I take a rain check on the sausage and rice? How will that person respond?
Guess it depends on who it is.
How do you think
I
this
mean,
person?
yes.
How do you think this person would respond?
Disappointed.
Disappointment. Good. First time disappointment. Let's say it happens again. How will that person respond?
I'd
Second
stop
time
cooking.
with the combo.
Disappointment with anger.
Ah, thank you. It's growing, right? Disappointment with anger. What happens on the third time?
I would have stopped cooking 2
They're gonna
times
stop.
ago.
I'm not slaving in this kitchen to make you this delicious sausage and rice dish anymore, because apparently you've got another source.
Yep.
That's what our brain does. Because our brain makes all these natural chemicals for us. Endorphins, noradrenaline,
I see where you're going with that.
yeah, GABA, acetylcholine, all these chemicals that the brain makes are dopamine, are all designed for how to balance us and to make us feel certain things. If I step on your toe, the brain sends endorphins to the region that you got the toe stepped on, and the pain goes away in a little bit. And that's because the brain sent endorphins there. The brain makes the endorphins. It's natural. It's actually, it's what heroin mimics. Adrenaline and dopamine is what cocaine and methamphetamine mimic. They're artificially look like they're kind of like counterfeits to what your brain makes. So when your cook, your personal chef, sees that you are no longer needing their services and shuts down the kitchen, you're left with what? How are you going to eat?
I have to find another way.
You're going to keep going to Hardee's, aren't you? And that's what happens, that develops from substance use to a substance use disorder.
So our brain says, okay.
The brain shuts
you're
down
doing
the
it
chemical
yourself.
production, so now
Mhm.
everything's going to feel worse. Whatever used to make you feel excited, whatever
'Cause
relieved
it's not
pain
the real
made you feel,
deal.
it's those real chemicals aren't made anymore.
Mhm.
The brain's just going to shut it down. The brain's kind of like that jealous chef that just says, if you need me, I'll make it for you, but if you got another source,
Do it that way.
I'm not going to work at producing these chemicals. That's the homemade meals that everyone gets. So addiction or substance use disorder develops as we by our actions shut down the brain's natural processes of making chemicals for us that help us with all of our feelings and emotions, all the way up and down the scale. Then again, the drugs that are taken from outside the body and put in, they look like those natural chemicals. They're actually mimicking, they look like, and they go through something called a blood-brain barrier, and they have their action on your brain. And that develops the dysregulated brain that we would call an addicted brain or a substance use disorder. And therein, you have found yourself a new normal, which means you're not going to feel normal unless you use.
That's true.
You won't feel normal. So using is no longer to have fun.
That's right.
Using is no longer to get high with your buddies or your girls.
Mhm.
Using is no longer to experiment. Using is now to feel
To give
normal.
you that baseline.
Yeah, to come back to the normal, because that dysregulated brain, and you've got and the chef's no longer cooking for you. So that's the process. The process of recovery is, first of all, stop the Hardee's, and you go through, what did you just say earlier? Those
Withdrawal.
1 or 2 years. Well, the immediate
yeah.
withdrawal, but then 1 or 2 years of finding normal
Weird.
again.
It's very weird.
The weird period that we call early recovery,
Mhm.
that doesn't feel quite right yet, but you know that you're moving towards, and then at some point, all of a sudden, you're going to say to yourself,
Yeah.
you know what? I feel normal again.
It does happen just like that. Just,
And while that's happening to you emotionally, it's happening in your brain chemically. Your brain is seeing, okay, Courtney's not stopping off at Hardee's anymore. Maybe I should start cooking for her again.
so that takes about 2 years for the brain to start.
Well,
A year
it's
to
not
two.
an exact science like that. We just find that 2 years seems to be the healthier brain
It's
imagery.
about, yeah,
And it's also what people report as in terms of feeling good again. This sense of goodness, this
Yeah.
normalness again. I feel okay again.
content. Yeah, you're just content, kind of.
So addiction makes sense whether you're a brain scientist or whether you're just experiencing it off the street and just walking through it. Those two things match up really well. And all the while, you have a brain that wants you to feel good again. Just like when you first got high and you wanted to feel better or wanted to feel maybe something, you were dealing with things and you wanted to feel good again. So that is really the down-to-earth, for me, story of addiction. And then the hopefulness of recovery, because my brain really, that person who cooks that sausage and rice probably would really like to make that sausage and rice for you. but just not willing to do it while you're stopping off at Hardee's on the way home.
That's such
Right?
a good
But
analogy.
we understand it at a human level. Your brain understands it at a chemical level. We understand it experientially. So it all makes sense.
So the relapse occurs when you're having a really bad day and you're in your recovery, but temptation comes and you're like, I can't hang anymore. And maybe you don't have good support network or whatever. You freaking go to Hardee's.
Yes.
You get to, and you realize,
And
Oh.
it didn't feel that good to
It
begin
didn't,
with.
no, you're like,
You don't really
why
like it
did I
that
do
much.
this? You know?
Yeah.
Hardee's doesn't taste that good.
Right. And then the day comes when going to Hardee's is repulsive.
Yep.
Like, never. Like, I don't
Absolutely.
want to go to
Man,
Hardee's.
that's the truth.
Forget it.
Yeah.
Tried it. Didn't work for me. Done with Hardee's.
Or drive home down a street that doesn't have a Hardee's. Or whatever you have to do.
Yeah. Yes. There you go.
Drive
There
down
you
the street,
go.
the Hardee's
Found an
isn't on that
alternate
street.
route.
And I don't like Wendy's, so go down that way.
Yeah.
Whatever it might be. So, but it's recovery is a I would say, and we'll get to this maybe in a little bit, but I think recovery is a courageous process. I don't think it's bad boys and girls just becoming good boys and girls. I think it's a courageous process because you're really going to fight upstream until normal finds you again, and then you're going to
Still don't
maintain
stop.
that.
You
That's
still
right, and
stop
then you
fighting.
maintain that. So it's like recovery, early recovery, and then it's maintenance of recovery. Like somebody who has hypertension, diabetes, or asthma, you kind of say, this is something I'm probably going to be struggling with for the rest of my life, and that's okay, because I'm going to learn to master it and manage it, and that's going to be okay. I'm going to turn something that someone else might say, oh, I'm sorry that you have diabetes, and I'm going to turn it into something positive and say, no, I've learned to manage it. Actually, I've gotten healthier as a result of it. I exercise more, I eat a better diet, I actually feel better. So, I mean, and that's what happens with people in recovery, and why their recovery stories are often so powerful for us to hear. Because they've not only gotten back to normal, but they have a joyous,
Real life.
hopeful story to tell
Yeah.
that encourages others. It's a wonderful thing, and we want to instill that in the people. You want to instill that hope in every woman that comes in Tides. Whether they're ready for it or not, doesn't matter. It's that hope instilling is so important.
I always say to people that, like, when I was first trying to get clean, things that a therapist said to me or whatever, I didn't get clean then. But when I finally did get clean, all that stuff that I had heard over the years started coming back.
It came
So
back.
even if these ladies don't get clean now, they will remember eventually. They will remember what we said, that we will be there for them. They'll remember. So
That's good. So, I'm going to jump into opioid use disorder specifically and a few things about that. But you know what? I think it's probably time to take a break. So let's take like a 5-10 minute break, stretch, get some more food or whatever. This has been great discussion, and then we'll come back. All right, we're back. So, in talking about opioid use disorder, we focus on that, especially with your work with Tides women, because opioid use disorder is most common. But we also know that opioid use disorder usually doesn't operate in a vacuum, meaning that other drug use is often involved, even though the opioid factor might be central, like the most emphasized. Other drugs are usually involved. So we know, like with substance use disorders, you see something, but with opioid use or OUD, you see some classic things. One is tolerance, which means more drugs are used to get the same effect, and that's why people use more and more, and they develop up to a certain level. They develop what's called a tolerance. And if they stop use, they have a defined withdrawal syndrome, which is very similar to a severe case of the flu. Now, historically, people usually didn't die from withdrawing from heroin, for example, even though they felt like they were going to die. But you know what? Any of you who've ever had a severe case of the flu, you kind of know that feeling. You're on the toilet saying, just kill me now.
yes.
Right? That feeling, that's the feeling that I usually heard from folks who were withdrawing from heroin. It was the just kill me now. It was but they usually didn't die from that. If somebody did die during a withdrawal, it was usually because something else was there that wasn't known before. Because opioids, including heroin, tend to mask illnesses, meaning that you don't know that you have a particular illness because the opioid is covering, masking it. And so if there is a complication, it's usually from that. There's the sense of loss of control, and that's the dysregulated brain. And as a technical matter, we won't do a lot on this, but as a technical matter, opiates and opioids are not the same thing. But now, because of the opioid crisis and the epidemic and the overdose, we term opioids for everything. But really, opiates, A-T-E-S at the end, means that you have to get something natural from the ground in order to make it. And that's heroin, the opium poppy. Or actually codeine as well. It requires opium, which has to be grown. Whereas the opioids can be completely made in a factory. Now the only one that's wrong on this list is fentanyl, which is an opioid. It does not require the opium poppy. But this gives you an idea, opiates and opioids. But now because of like I said, because of the epidemic, we just call everything an opioid. Technically not true, but we know what it means. The big ones that drove the opioid crisis that basically ran from the early stages from 2007 to 2017 were OxyContin, Vicodin, Percocet. Those were the ones that a large percentage of people became addicted to, developed their opioid use disorder before they even turned to street drugs like heroin. And we saw this in surveys back in 2012 where teenagers could tell us they could get a prescription opioid faster than they can get marijuana. So we knew that the tide had changed. And where were they getting these opioids from? They were getting them from mom and dad's medicine cabinet, from their family doctor, those kinds of things. So we know that opioids relieve pain. Remember I talked about the brain chemicals that it naturally makes of endorphins? Those are pain relieving chemicals. Euphoria, the sense of well-being. But opioids are a central nervous system depressant. And then this last thing on this list, which I want to focus on for a minute, is synergistic effects. Synergism. Anybody know what synergism is? It's okay if you don't. Take a guess.
One thing activates the other. In other words, potentiates the action of the other.
Good, right. And I like to describe it in really math terms. So if you take a dose, so all depressants have synergistic relationships to each other. And what are our depressants? Things like Xanax, alcohol, and all the opioids. So if you combine a central nervous system depressant, alcohol, benzos, heroin, for example, you might have a dose of Xanax that you always take when you're nervous and you're comfortable with that dose. You might have a certain amount of alcohol that you drink that you feel like I can keep my stuff together when I drink this much, but if I drink more than that, I get out of control. You follow what I'm saying? And so, but what happens, synergistic effects means that if you combine these depressants, rather than adding their effects, they multiply their effects. So let's think of a strength of 4. So if you take 3 things that have a strength of 4 that are depressants, you would think it would be 4 plus 4 plus 4 equals 12, but it doesn't. It's 4 times 4 times 4, which equals 64. So you think you're getting a strength of 12, 4 times 4 is 16.
I don't say-
16 times 4 is
That's right.
64. All right, this is what working. That's what I'm saying. I think of it in terms of math. So you think you're getting a strength, we'll just call it a strength of 12, but you're really getting a strength of 64. So synergism is usually a piece of the puzzle when someone overdoses or lands in the emergency room. It's usually not from one drug. It's usually one drug combined. Now the emergency right might say, we have a heroin overdose. Well, was the person drinking too? Right? Did they also have Xanax that they had taken recently? And Xanax has a long half-life, blah, blah, blah. So synergistic effects are really important to understand because people think in silos about what they can handle. But it doesn't work when you're talking about depressants. Doesn't work. So I try to educate folks about that because sometimes they just assume that they can add those effects. Then came around 2017 really a rise. So the overdose and the deaths that happened prior to 2017 didn't include a lot of fentanyl in it, but then 2017 to now, the last 8 years, we've seen more fentanyl and other related things in the drug supply that has really made us no longer calling it an opioid epidemic. We're now calling it just an overdose epidemic, meaning that there are different drugs involved in the overdose. Drugs like, fentanyl fentanyl was used very powerfully and importantly in surgeries. It's not a bad drug. It can help somebody very quickly have a very serious surgery take place and they not feel the pain, and then they're done with it. Or sometimes they're given a patch that decreases the dose of it over time, over a matter of hours or days, to basically make them manage a surgery. But then it became a deadly additive because it started to get made in labs elsewhere and put into the drug supply. And so we had people who, they only used cocaine and all of a sudden they were showing positive for fentanyl, and they would say, I don't use fentanyl. And I said, well, you do, and you didn't know it, because that's what's put in the drug supply. And so these overdoses, because the opioid level combined with whatever else was beyond what the body and the heart could sustain. And so people would overdose because fentanyl as a sedative or a depressant is going to slow down breathing and heart rate to dangerous levels. Especially when you don't even know how much fentanyl you're getting and what the equivalent strength. I mean, in a surgery, somebody's measuring it very exactly to make sure we give enough and not too much, right? It doesn't work that way on the street. So the fentanyl drove the crisis. Then we saw something really crazy happen the last 3 years. People started choosing fentanyl. And you would think if you haven't experienced an opioid use disorder, you'd say, that's crazy. Why would somebody choose something that's causing overdoses all over the country? But remember, you're talking about a dysregulated brain. You're talking about sausage and rice. You're talking about somebody that's, if you go to Hardee's, you can buy one and get one free. Sometimes you don't even need the second burger. You don't care if I can get one free. So the dysregulated brain does not think the same. It seeks the maximum amount of strength, not the least amount of strength. Get that? That's not because somebody's stupid or because that's what the brain is seeking. It's seeking the most of the chemical. So when something comes out stronger, people who are experimenting with drug use, they run away from it. But people who are dependent on drug use, they run towards it. That's why the police department used to call us every time they have like some information about where drug pockets were, and we talked with them about be very careful how you do the announcements, because they're thinking that saying that the drug supply is too strong the heroin is no longer 20%, it's 80% pure or whatever it is. They think that that'll make people avoid it. But with the addicted population, it actually makes people run towards
It's
it.
crazy.
But it works both ways. People who experiment, they'll run away from it because their brain is not seeking it yet. So they'll say, oh, I don't want to overdose. But a person who already has a use disorder active is going to say, that's what I need. We follow, so it works two different ways. So even the PSAs, these public messages, have to be very carefully crafted so that you're not just telling everybody to go rush towards the dangerous stuff thinking that you're helping. So it's a challenge, but we saw that people started choosing fentanyl, and more people were coming in saying that's their drug of choice. That's what they wanted. About just under 3 out of 10 fatal opioid overdoses had benzos in the mix. Xanax, Valium.
So they're cutting it with that.
Yeah, or they're using on top of it.
Gotcha. Okay.
It can be either one.
Okay.
So it's not just an opioid overdose. It's more than that usually. Alcohol's involved a lot. Then you got xylazine, ketamine, and I don't have time to go over these. You have this in here, and you can do your own homework on those particular drugs. But we found ourselves with, this absurd number, this horrific number of overdoses every day, and North Carolina was no exception to that. Now, the risk factors, I want to talk for a few minutes about the risk factors for overdose, because this is really important. Early recovery is one of my big worries. You have people here at Tides who are in early recovery. We call early recovery because they've made the step to get into recovery. And you think if they're doing well, sometimes we get lulled into thinking that they're out of harm's way. And they're actually in greater harm's way. Because the tolerance that we talked about, that they achieved before when they were actively using, they no longer have. The tolerance went away. Which means that a slip could be fatal for them. Because their body no longer has the tolerance built up to handle. So, your memory is, it's kind of like, I used to be able to eat 3 burgers at a time. And then you go, and after the first burger, you're starting to gag and you're looking for a Tums, right? And you're thinking, okay, my body no longer can do what I did before. And it's very similar to that with tolerance, with the opioid, and with other drugs as well, but with opioids especially because of the factor of how it brings the heart rate dangerously low and the breathing dangerously low. Previous overdoses, tolerance changes that we just talked about, mixing drugs with other depressants, post-incarcerations, people who are coming out of jail settings are like 40 times more at risk than the general population. That's why we are working to be in the jail with folks and actually get them connected to treatment, and if they need to be on medications, get them on medication before they even leave the jail, so that it's a smooth transition out. Because that immediate time outside of jail is when a lot of the deaths are happening. And of course, you never know how much fentanyl, even if you never know how much fentanyl is in a drug supply. You just don't know the strength of it. How would you know it? It's not regulated by anybody. So those are all risk factors for overdose, but the one that gets me the most is the first one, early recovery. I can tell you mothers, dads that have told me their stories of their children who have died from overdose. And I'm reading a book from a friend of mine right now who wrote a memoir to his son who died of overdose. Usually they tell me, I thought my daughter was doing so well. And you know what I usually tell them? She was. But you see, a slip was fatal for her. When she was out there actively using wasn't fatal for her. She had developed a tolerance, and that doesn't mean she's not at risk for fatality, but she actually has a better chance of survival in active use. When you're in early recovery and you lose that tolerance, that first slip is so dangerous. And I do that to encourage the parents to realize that what they saw in progress with their kids, usually adult kids, I'm saying kids, but some of them were 30 years old or 35 or whatever. But what they saw usually was real and genuine. It wasn't a fake. They were wondering, did my daughter fool me? That kind of thing. Did she just make this up for me and really she was living? No, actually she was doing well. But addiction in this environment is deadly. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 30 years ago when I was doing counseling, I had people leave treatment all the time. They'd go relapse, they'd come back. Kenny, I'm ready to get back in. I need it. Doesn't happen that often anymore. Usually when people leave treatment unsuccessfully and we don't see them, it's because they die. So it's a different environment. It's a different thing. We tell people, look, it's not like it was 30 years ago, where you can go out there and relapse, then come back to treatment when you're ready. People used to say, well, come back when you're ready. I don't say that. I would never say that to someone. I'd say, come back now. If you're thinking, think this. Come back now. Don't take the risk. You used to get second, third, and fourth, and fifth, and sixth, seventh chances with relapse. It doesn't exist anymore.
Is there any thing to study about why the brain gets people to go back out? Like, is it just the overwhelm? Because if they've been there 30, 60, 90 days, what is it that makes them?
I don't know. You're talking about human behavior, though.
Yeah.
And think about human behavior. I've made some strides sometimes in like physical fitness goals that I made or things that I made, and then all of a sudden I'm going back and I'm thinking, why am I going back? I felt so good when I was doing this every week, and then something happened. You go on you go somewhere, or something happens and you get off track, and then it's like, why am I not doing that? Human behavior that makes us healthy takes really a rigorous approach to it. It can't be casual. We don't stay healthy casually. We stay healthy only if we are extremely diligent. It's work. And when you get off the rails, sometimes you're off the rails for a year before it comes back to you. I felt so much better last year when I was doing this. Whether it's going to the gym or whether it's going for a walk every morning or, whatever it is, we get out of patterns that are good for us. And it's just human.
Yeah.
I like to look at it that way because sometimes we look at the person suffering from a use disorder as though there's some kind of strange animal, there's something wrong with them. It's human. It's just that it takes that extreme behavior change, as we talked about earlier, and then doing consistently in order to be healthy. We do have, that's why Coastal, even with these overdose factors, it's why we established a quick response team to go out there and get people who are at high risk for overdose or who are just overdosed and survive and get them into treatment because they're not likely to survive the next time. So having said all that, when you're thinking about people coming into treatment, what would be the primary goal of treatment? What do you think?
Detox and
Detox?
Sobriety.
Sobriety? Somebody else?
keeping them from going back out.
Keeping them from going back out?
Support network.
Support network? All of those things are good. But number one is safety. Number two is recovery. And I can tell you that it was the opposite 25 years ago for me. Now it's safety, because 25 years ago people weren't overdosing every time they went out. So I didn't have to worry about it so much. It was like, they'll be back. I can name you people. They'll be back. And sure enough, they were back 25 years ago. Now I don't see them again. It's like, or if I see them, I go, wow, they're still alive. I'm so glad. It's like, yes, they made it. Somehow they made it. But our first goal is safety. Our second goal is treatment. It's changed. for all the reasons that we've talked about. You know, treatment is a system of therapies and pharmacotherapy, meaning medications, delivered to assist over time individuals in their recovery. Recovery is the process that an individual and or family goes through in pursuing a healthier life and freedom from addictive, destructive patterns of thinking and acting. Those are my definitions. You can have your own definitions, that's fine. Those are mine. In other words, and the reason why I went to that process of distinguishing is sometimes I think we confuse treatment and recovery. Meaning, sometimes we think that we're in charge of someone's recovery. You really are not. You're providing a form of treatment, meaning that you're putting tools in somebody's hand that can assist them. That's what TIDES does. It puts tools in women's hands that can assist them. But recovery belongs to them. It's their recovery. It's not yours. You don't get credit for recovery. You get credit for putting good tools in those women's hands. And that's good. But they get their own props for their recovery. They got to do that work. You know, that's their process. And you do have the confounding factor at times of a co-occurring mental health disorder. I've found that in our treatment population over at Coastal Risings, I would say about 40%, maybe 50%, had people who came for a substance use disorder treatment had a co-occurring mental health disorder. Now, in some populations, some settings, it might be higher or lower, but I found that it worked out that way most of the time.
That's the same thing as dual diagnosis.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Oh, I'm glad you asked that. So a co-occurring mental health disorder sometimes is referred to as dual diagnosis, or referred to as a co-occurring disorder. Not only that, sometimes they had a co-occurring medical disorder along with it. That made it more complicated. So you could have depression, diabetes, and opioid use disorder. Makes it more complicated. You have 3. That's why I don't use the term dual diagnosis, because sometimes there's 3, right? But it's a co-occurring, it's happening at the same time. The most common are going to be your mood and your anxiety disorders. The most common. People with criminal histories, they usually have traits that are close to an antisocial personality. They don't necessarily qualify for that disorder, but you'll see some traits of that. But we find that pretty regularly. And this is what I mentioned before, hypertension, diabetes, and asthma. The relapse rates are pretty much the same for those, within a few percentage points. Here's drug dependence, type 1 diabetes, hypertension, and asthma. Relapse rates were pretty similar. A little higher with hypertension and asthma. A slight lower with diabetes. But we know that treatment works. We see drug use go down, we see crime go down, we see employment go up. And here's the fun part of this. Research has shown us this, and this is a great thing to understand. It does not matter how motivated somebody is on day 1. It has no influence on their recovery rates or their success rates. No influence at all. Whether somebody comes in kicking and screaming and angry, or somebody comes in highly motivated, smiling, and saying, I'm ready to do it now. That has absolutely, statistically, no influence over whether they're going to be successful in their recovery. There's only 2 factors. Motivation is not one of them. Because there's only 2 factors that influence whether somebody is going to do well. Factor number 1. Do they develop a strong bond or connection with their provider? Meaning the treatment team or the therapist or whoever they're working with, whatever is their team. And with TIDES, it's kind of a combined team effort, because you got the TIDES team and then you have the treatment team component if they're connected to an agency like Coastal Horizons, but if they have a strong bond or connection, and number two, if they stay in treatment long enough. Usually it has to be at least 1 to 2 years, going back to what we just talked about with the brain. So if they have those two things, they usually do well. The research says that it's on their side. Has nothing to do with how motivated or angry or unmotivated. We used to say, well, wait till they hit bottom when they really want help. No, it doesn't matter if they really want help. If you have a good staff that connects with them and keeps them in treatment, their motivation will grow over time. Doesn't matter at the start. I've had people come into treatment saying, I'm ready to quit, I'm gonna do it, I'm good to go, just, I'm here, I'm ready for recovery. And 3 days later, they disappear. And I've had other people come into treatment kicking and screaming, angry, looking at me like I was the worst enemy in the earth. But they stayed, and they became excellent, successful outcome. And they would tell you months or a year later, you know, I hated this place when I walked in the door, but you know what? You know what? This is where I found recovery. Don't worry about day one. Motivation level doesn't matter. And B.F. Skinner said it's at the start anyway, the only people really motivated for change are wet babies. We do know that people with mental health disorders, including substance use disorders, on average die 25 years sooner than the general population.
Wow.
So if you normally would live to 85, you'll be lucky to live past 60 if you don't find recovery and a healthy life. So people who continue in that pattern, and they usually die from a medical illness, 87% of them. And so we're really talking in recovery about this whole process of re-regulation. Not stopping at Hardee's. Going back, letting your brain cook the sausage and rice. Right? And your brain starts to regulate. And sometimes your brain needs medications to assist that process. And that's okay. And I'll tell you, we really don't want to have any judgment about people's medications. If it's working for them, then we should walk with them. As long, we shouldn't say, oh, you should only be on that medication for X amount of time. That's really that shouldn't really be a conversation piece. You should be on the medication as long as you feel like it's benefiting you. And when you're ready, and sometimes we have people that say, I'm ready to come off the medication, I want to try that. We say, we'll walk with you in that process, and there's no shame, no problem if it doesn't work, because the medication's there for you if you need it. And I would say the same thing in a treating a substance use disorder, but I would say the same thing to someone who's taking medication for depression. Sometimes people get to a place and they say, I want to stop taking my antidepressants. I say, okay, we'll walk with you, but you know what? If that doesn't work, that's okay. That's okay.
Safety net.
Yeah. The medication options that are approved by the FDA, methadone, buprenorphine products, and naltrexone. I will say that naltrexone or Vivitrol has a very low percentage success rate. There's probably 10% or less of people that are going to be successful in that. There's some medical reasons for that. Despite what the Vivitrol salespeople will tell you, it's a small percentage that will do well that way. And I just read a study that said that people on Vivitrol are at higher risk for relapse and death than people who continue to use. And it just blew my mind.
Is it because they can't feel it?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
The reason is because it makes it so if you use, you don't feel it. So what do you do if you're a compulsive person and you use and you don't get it? I'm going to use again. Doggone it, I'm going to use again. And you can overdose without even feeling it until it's too late. By the time you feel it, it's too late. So, I'm saying that, and I'm not anti-Vivitrol. I just think it's a small group of people that will do well on it. And I think you have to have an extremely strong circle of support, and you have to be very well insulated environmentally from relapse triggers because for various reasons. So just something to be aware of. Buprenorphine and methadone are much more reliable because methadone's a full agonist, which means it completely occupies the opioid receptors. And I'll talk about pros and cons of that. And buprenorphine products are partial agonists. So the benefit of buprenorphine as a partial agonist is it's a little bit safer because it doesn't fully occupy the opioid receptors. So it's harder to use and overdose in a relapse if you're on buprenorphine. Methadone as a full agonist is more effective, but is a little riskier and needs a little more monitoring because it's easier if you use to overdose. So methadone is more effective, but needs closer monitoring. Buprenorphine is a little less effective, but may work for many people, and you can get away with, for lack of a better term, that's the wrong term. You don't need as intense monitoring for safety purposes. Does that make sense? So that's why, for example, an opioid treatment program that does methadone has people come in more frequently than someone who's prescribed buprenorphine, because there's less worry about the monitoring piece to make sure somebody's safe. The medications are both really good medications and they work, but some people do better on methadone, some do better on buprenorphine. Those who do better on methadone need a closer monitoring kind of system to make sure that everything's safe. And especially safe in the first 4 to 6 weeks. That's why I don't think it's a good idea to prescribe methadone and have somebody get it out of a pharmacy. I just don't think it's a good idea. I think if somebody's in treatment for 1 or 2 years and very stable, then maybe that's a place where that could be okay, but not in the early stages of treatment when people are more likely to relapse and all these other things can happen. So it's not a question of a medication being good or bad. It's a question of just kind of its level of safety over against its level of effectiveness. Does that make sense? You're kind of weighing that. If somebody was uncertain whether to start on buprenorphine or methadone, I might start them on buprenorphine first, and if they're not doing that well, quickly transition them to methadone because it's easier to go up than to go down. But if someone has a long history of opioid use disorder and repeated relapses, I'd probably more likely start them on methadone.
What is the medication, the
Probrutin?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a long-acting version of.
So it's the same thing.
It's the
just
same
a little
thing.
longer acting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Same thing, longer acting. Suboxone is a combination of naltrexone and the buprenorphine product that a lot of docs are more confident in because Suboxone will give a little resistance to relapse, but people can use on top of it. I've heard that many times. Oh, I can use on top of the Suboxone, but it is a deterrent, so some prefer it. But I have some suspicions about it because Suboxone was marketed heavily by the company because it was much more expensive. So it's like, okay, is this money-driven motive or is this really treatment-driven motive? I'm going to stay out of that controversy. That's all I'm going to say. But just to say that all of the buprenorphine products can be very effective and helpful to people. Subutex, Suboxone, and the long-acting ones that have come out can be effective. You just want to make sure that the person's on the medication and able to find kind of stability. The cool thing about, I'm going to use my board for just a minute. This is going to be, all right. The cool thing, if I can get this to stand up and not fall, about.
Do you need a Vanna to hold this up?
I think I'm all right. But, so, when a person, that line, we're going to call that your normal. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
This is your normal. All right. And when you're using opioids, when you use, it goes down, down, down in terms of depressant effects. And then the rebound on the withdrawal goes up, up, up in terms of agitation, withdrawal, et cetera, right? So the life of an addicted person goes like that. It's a traumatic life. It's trauma right there. Now, the cool thing about methadone and buprenorphine is they're both fairly long acting, and they stabilize the functions of the body and the brain. So a lot of people that say, oh, I don't believe in methadone or buprenorphine because you're just replacing one drug for another. That's not really true. Actually, when you take those with an opioid use disorder, you're actually normalizing your brain functions. So it's like medicine and poison. You know, you tell a kid that, right? You say, this is medicine for mommy, but if you took it, it would be poison. You don't want poison, right? So your medicine is your baby's poison, or your child's poison, or someone who doesn't have that disorder, right? Or whatever the situation that pill is treating. So it's the same principle that methadone and buprenorphine basically run right along this sense of normalizing. They de-traumatize the functioning of the brain and get it very close to a re-regulated state. So that's why when a person's on a stable dose of buprenorphine or methadone, they start over time to feel normal again. They're not high. They're not. The brain is not processing it as a get high event. The brain is processing it as a stabilizing event. It's a different thing in the brain. It's medicine. Now, you go outside of that, and if you took methadone on the street or bup on the street just for the heck of it, yeah, you get high, right? But again, it's that medicine poison analogy. It's not replacing one drug for another. It's taking a drug that acts as medicine to stabilize your brain and your body's functioning. That's the key piece to understand about these medications.
Is it safe to stay on these for a lifetime, or like, is it per person?
It is safe whether somebody stays on any medication. Let's keep it as a health thing. Any medication is really a choice between them and their doc. And if they want to try, they shouldn't do it because of what other people think. They shouldn't do it because of stigma. They shouldn't do it because of shame. They should do it for the same purposes that you do make any decision about medication. They should make it on a health decision, the benefits and the risks. And if you're doing well on a medication, you got to be careful stopping that medication. So always weigh the benefits and the risks. It's a basic health question. All right, that's the end of my show. All right, so you've got these, and you got some pictures here of the opioid receptors. Now, isn't that cool? Remember I told you the story about your brain making the natural chemicals? You actually have opioid receptors in your brain. I mean, we have those. So your brain's fine with its own cooking. It just knows that the sausage is rice and better than a Hardee's burger for you. That's the only difference. I'm going to skip over that. OTPs, and OBOTs, just to know the difference between it. An OBOT is basically an office-based prescribing of buprenorphine. But they can't prescribe methadone on an office base. OTPs are licensed opioid treatment programs. Coastal Horizons is a licensed OTP, for example. And we can prescribe and dispense methadone or buprenorphine.
Say that again about the OTP. What's the
An
difference?
OTP is a licensed program that prescribes and dispenses methadone and buprenorphine.
Got it.
OBOTs are only private doctor offices or health clinics that prescribe buprenorphine products, and those have to be retrieved from a pharmacy. Just the difference with that. I'm going to skip over that. in the interest of time, because we're covering so much material,
It's good though.
that my treatment philosophy and our treatment philosophy, and most people that I know who work in the treatment field would say they don't believe in medications alone. Any more than I would say that about diabetes or hypertension. It's okay, the medication is a stabilizing force for you. It gives you the space to now do the behavior change
Absolutely.
that makes your recovery lifelong and you healthier. And so it's medication assisted treatment, it's behavioral treatment and other supports. It's the whole combination of that. I'm not an advocate, I'll just say it out loud, I'm not an advocate of just giving people medications and saying that's okay. I don't think that really helps people in the recovery process. It would stabilize the brain functioning, but recovery is much deeper than that. Because people don't just come to addiction out of a vacuum. There's a lot going on in their life leading up to it, and there's a lot of struggles recovering from it. And I think you need other support systems, all the way from 12-step recovery support systems to professional behavioral treatment support systems to other things in people's life that allow them to pursue a healthier life. And I think the medications go well in that context. There are people that disagree with me on that, and they think that we just need to get the medications out to people, period.
Well,
And I disagree with
it's
that.
kind of the same with every disease or chronic illness. It's like all encompassing team.
Yep.
Not just. Hopefully they don't just throw medication at you, but like it takes like a team of people.
Right, and the people who do the best are the healthiest, are the people who do that kind of whole person work rather than
Yeah.
just say, oh, I just need my meds. That's all I need. We talked about this. The bottom line is continue with the course of treatment as long as the benefits outweigh the risks. And that really should be determined not by a program, but by the patient in consultation with his or her treatment team. Let's see. I think I'll skip over that. And there is a SAMHSA federal module talking about treating pregnant women with opioid use disorder. We do know that the birth outcomes are improved, and it's okay for them to be, and it's even preferable, unless it's at the end of the pregnancy and they're hospitalized where they're monitored closely, it's preferable for them to be on methadone or buprenorphine. And what's the reason for that? Given the thing that I drew on the diagram, what's the reason? Why do we want them on methadone or buprenorphine if they're pregnant and on opioid use disorder? Somebody give me a guess.
So that their body can stable out,
Yes.
and the baby can too.
Yes, because that trauma that the person is going through, the lows of depression and the highs of the anxiety levels there, transfer from the mom to the unborn. And so the worst thing for the unborn is trauma, is that those extremes. If you can lower those extremes, right, and get that stabilization, then the process of the baby once born is much more manageable. And usually now, with the hospital getting on board with things, usually can be managed in 7 days or less. Sometimes a little more depending on the person. It can be individualized, but they've gotten it down to a pretty doggone good science now to make that process healthier.
I've always wondered about when someone is pregnant and they're on methadone or Subutex, whatever. It doesn't matter what the dose is that they take on like a withdrawal for the baby, or how beneficial it is for the baby. Either way.
Well, the rule of thumb is the baby will be fine if the mother is stable.
Okay.
That's the rule of thumb. So whatever dose is necessary to get the mom close to this
Will be most beneficial.
is what's best for the
Okay.
baby.
Okay.
Yeah, we want the baby, and don't ever say that a baby was born addicted. Babies are never addicted. It's just not. It's just they don't have loss of control. They don't have compulsive behavior. They don't fall into a use disorder.
Right.
So people say, oh, that's a stigmatizing and really
That makes
that's a shaming.
yeah.
Oh, how could you do that and make your baby be born
The
addicted?
hospital was
Baby's not born addicted.
no. They
Baby's
have
born with some
symptoms.
health challenges, but guess what? The health challenges of babies born with women who smoke and drink alcohol is worse
Yep.
than I actually heard this. I don't know enough about it in the studies, but I heard that even during the crack epidemic, when they called these babies crack babies, that actually they didn't pay attention to the fact that the women were smoking and drinking alcohol, and that's really was a major contributor what they were seeing, that it really even wasn't a pure cocaine effect. It was actually because and cocaine and alcohol usually were used together in combination. So sometimes, people say things that kind of the street words of it are not accurate. The safest delivery for a baby whose mother suffers from an opioid use disorder is to be on stabilizing medications when the baby is born, period. It's just the way it is. And you'll have the healthiest baby outcome. And we don't know of anything that tells us that there's going to be additional suffering of the baby once they're safely withdrawn from the medications and what the woman was taking.
Yeah, because the chances of them taking other street drugs, if they're not on maintenance, is
It's greater.
skyrocketing.
Oh, the worst thing to happen during a pregnancy is relapse.
Absolutely.
Because then you throw not only the mother but
then you're back
the
on the-
unborn back into
Yep.
that whole same cycle
Yep.
of ups and downs. I'm going to skip this because I want to get to all 4 sections. We're still on second section. Well, anyway, any questions or comments about that? Because we're going to go to trauma. Now, we're talking about actually that the trauma that can be to the unborn. But we know that most of our folks have experienced trauma in their lives. That trauma can take many shapes and sizes and forms. It's not the same, but you probably hear some similar stories. The idea of being trauma informed or trauma sensitive is really, and let me take a quick snapshot. Debbie, how are we doing on time? Oh, we're good. Okay, all right. We're good. I'm going to do a little bit on this, then we're going to take we'll take one more break. So, what are the kinds of traumas that you see consistent?
Post-traumatic.
All right, post-traumatic, child abuse,
Rape.
rape,
Intimate relationship elements.
Domestic, yeah.
So coming into a helping setting, people bring their baggage with them. Their luggage comes with them. Unless they have already somehow found, and usually the folks that you're going to see in this level of early recovery won't have successfully dealt with the trauma that they experienced. They'll still bring with it shame. They'll bring with it these ideas of what they should have done or could have done. They'll bring with it bitterness or anger of what was done. So they're bringing that, and I say that baggage not in a critical way, but it comes with them because they've never figured out how to let go of that baggage or how to process that baggage. And being trauma informed kind of is a way of saying we recognize them. We're not going to contribute to the shaming. We're not going to expect, we recognize that you're bringing that with you. If we're helpful, we'll help you process it. And we won't expect it to be done all at once either. It's not like leave your trauma at the door and come on in. No, we're here for you, and we understand the trauma that went alongside of you for years, and we're not expecting you to get over in a day what you had to walk through for years. But there is a hopeful process. So the idea of being trauma informed is that you don't want to accidentally re-traumatize the person. And I believe it happens oftentimes accidentally. We just don't realize it. One way is developing, I said about the successful outcomes about rapport and bonding and connectedness. Establishing good rapport is the best way to start the traumatization. So, building a strong rapport and creating a sense of safety is the most important first step. Not only that you're here, but that the space is safe. There's an element of safety coming into Tides, right? Because now you're not on the street. But there's another element of safety is my history safe here? Am I safe here? Am I going to be treated with the kind of respect that makes me feel like it's okay to let down my anxiety, maybe not completely, but maybe from this level to this level? And will the person I'm working with be okay with that? So one way is to constantly reaffirm the safety of the space here. So I just want to remind you, you're safe here. We're not going to judge you here. That's not our place. We're going to walk with you. It says here at the towards the bottom, you see the 6 key principles of a trauma-informed approach. This comes from the Fed's kind of handout on trauma. The 6 key principles are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality. We're doing this together. Empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. Some of that, I think the most important of all those is that first, the safety. You create an environment that's safe and then you reinforce it. Mm-hmm. It's always safe. You can talk about anything and it'll be safe space here to talk. We know some people had adverse childhood experiences. Not everybody. Some people's adverse experiences happen later. So don't assume, right? But we know that's oftentimes
This group may not be very aware of ACEs. I don't know if we have a minute to go over
so ACEs,
what the ACEs are.
Yeah, so
what you're looking at.
Yeah, so ACEs looks at kind of levels of abuse, neglect, and or dysfunction that went on during childhood. And usually when people have a score that's higher, their ACEs score is higher, they're more likely to basically bring that traumatization into their adult life. And if it's not been talked about, walked through, processed, oftentimes it continues to trip someone up.
How do you broach someone who is clearly has some of that going on, but you make them feel safe, but at the same time they don't feel like they can let that guard down?
I did hear somebody once say that the most important question that somebody ever asked them about their trauma was tell me what happened to you, as opposed to what's wrong with you.
Right.
Tell me what happened to you, because it reaffirms the idea that you're not to blame for what someone else did. But when you said what's wrong with you, or why are you this way,
right,
you're actually unintentionally saying, what are you responsible for? Mm-hmm. But to get to know someone, to give them safe space before they can get to the place of what they can do, you really want them to feel free to tell you. So I remember somebody said that was the most amazing thing when someone finally said to them, tell me what happened to you. then they told
Wow.
them. They
That's
told
it.
their story. And so you got to be patient and hear their stories.
And
It's
just
like,
be ready when they're ready.
yeah. Well, and it's also letting them know that you want to hear their story.
Right.
And it's what happened to them. It's not what they did or why they are the way they are or, you know, how did this happen? Because that doesn't say. It's got to really be framed the way that says, tell me what happened to you. It's like, yeah. So now I can say it that way. This is what others did to me.
Because most likely they've already blamed themselves for
Oh,
years.
1,000
before
times.
that. Yeah.
1,000,000 times.
Mhm.
I should have done this. I should have done
Yeah,
that. Why is
yeah.
this? What's wrong with me? All of those things.
Mhm.
Asking those questions or giving them in that kind of way doesn't do anything but re-traumatize.
Right.
You know, but what happened? Oh, you want to know what happened to me? Let me tell you.
If you
And
really-
and her story, the person that I heard share this, her story, she said her recovery started when someone finally asked her that
Wow.
question. Debbie?
I wanted to share statistics because we started tracking adverse childhood experiences about a year and a half ago. Because I'm so intrigued by it, and I think it helps prepare us as a staff on being able to handle and work with this population in a positive way. So now it's been a while. Excuse me. It's been a while since we've done the count, but the last time that we did the count, of the 10 questions that you're asked, our women's average was 6 out of 10 that has had 6 of those 10 adverse childhood experiences. That's huge.
Yes.
When I took resiliency training, they talked about the cutoff kind of being around 3, like 1, 2, or 3. They may kind of go in an area, in a direction you don't want them to go in, but 6, and not only that, but 62% of these women were physically abused, 85% sexually molested or abused, 77% did not feel safe and protected in their home, 92% divorced parents, 54% had someone addicted to drugs or alcohol in the home, and 54% had at least one family member in prison.
Yeah, there you have it. Thank
So
you. That's
you
very
can
powerful.
see how this can really affect
And
our outcomes.
we all feel like we're alone in it. You know what I mean? So to be able to hear that is
That can be liberating for folks.
right.
That can be liberating. I'm not alone. I didn't go through this, just me. The impact of trauma is interesting because when something comes up, and all of us know this as a human experience. For example, if someone walked through this door right now that you had a wild crush on, what would happen to you inside?
Your heart races.
Butterflies.
Your heart rate would go up, you'd start sweating, your mouth would get dry. Okay, now, check this out. Your whole system would go into this fight or flight kind of thing. You wouldn't, all this. What happened if somebody walked through that door that did something wrong to you?
Same thing.
Same exact physical symptoms, you'd interpret them differently. You'd want to hide or whatever, or want to look for the nearest knife,
Exit.
or a club to, you might want to do something different, but your physical symptoms would be the same. People who suffer from trauma that they have not processed, and even when they have processed at times, will have these involuntary physical reactions to things that remind them
Smell.
of their trauma. It can be a smell, it can be a person, it can be being asked at a physical exam to take off their clothes. It can be all kinds
It can be a
of.
tone of voice.
What's that?
It can be a tone.
Yeah.
Oh,
of
a tone of
voice.
voice. Yes, a tone of voice.
Big time.
So we want to be aware that our inadvertent behavior could trigger. And I would say, we're not perfect, so we might make mistakes in that. I would say the best way to do that is talk about it with the residents. Talk about it. Say, look, I want to make sure the space feels comfortable and
It's a good
safe for
idea.
you. Sometimes I might say something in a way that reminds you of something negative. I want you to tell me when it does. See, rather than hiding it or hoping or trying to be perfect, because you're not perfect, I'm not perfect, we're going to make mistakes. Open the dialogue and say, it's okay to tell us. If I used a tone of voice that reminds you of someone that once did something to you, I'll try to work on that, because I want you to feel safe in this space. It's
That
okay
is
to
such
say
a
it.
good idea.
So, secrets in the dark grow fungus and mold, right? And they get larger than life. It's better to just bring it out. Hey, when I talk to you, do I make you feel uncomfortable? Tell me. Because sometimes we're reminded. And if I can do something to make it better, I will. That's so liberating. It makes, okay, you actually care to even ask for the feedback. But don't expect to be perfect, no matter what you do. You'll do something that'll trigger somebody. But be aware of the trigger and be comfortable talking about it. That's the moral of that story.
One last thing on that.
Yes.
I think sometimes inadvertently we talk at them
Yes.
instead of to them, especially when we're holding them accountable for cleaning their apartments.
Yeah.
Or, did they do this or did they do that? I'm not saying that we're still not going to have to provide accountability for those things, but I definitely know that we need to have a softer voice about it.
I agree.
And
'Cause you
a
have
more-
rules.
A more gentle one.
Yeah, and you got rules and you got things, and of course people need to know the rules. But you need to find ways to give people that sense that they also have power and control over things. And so you have to balance that. Here are the house rules, but there are also things that are going to be your choices and your things to decide about. In other words, you want to make people feel empowered in some way. You don't want to make them feel a victim of the house rules. You want to make them feel that they're a participant in it.
For example, you go in, the apartment is trashed. I mean, it's just beyond ridiculous. And you know from the shift notes that you're not the first person that has, documented that we can't seem to get these ladies to keep it clean. Instead of, and I have done this myself, walking in and going, I can't believe it's still trashed in here. I don't know what's going on, ladies, but I want this clean by 5 o'clock. I have absolutely said that. Not the right way to handle it. What I would do is say, hey, can you guys come here? Let's sit down. I know that y'all got a lot going on, and I know it's hard to keep this place clean, and you're working now, kudos to that. When do you think you can get this clean? When can you guys work this out?
Yeah, let's
Then
come
the
up with a
house that
plan.
Make them make the commitment to
Make
us.
them,
Okay,
it
yeah,
empowers
I like that.
them. They just, now if they say at the end of the week and it's Monday, that's obviously not going to work.
But you bring them back together again.
Yeah.
It's let's make a plan,
Yeah.
because even though our rule is that you got to keep the place clean, we want you to take charge of that process. And it's a balancing act, because if you only tell them the rule, then you're more like a parent. And whatever they suffered from a parent, that's what you are to them.
Yeah.
They're not just the one telling to clean the room, you're also the one that beat them, or whatever the situation might be.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And also, a lot of y'all, if you've been here a while, have heard me say it, but rules minus relationship will always equal rebellion. So if we don't have a relationship with them, we're going to get
Okay.
much less of a response that's positive from them if we're just
Yeah.
throwing rules at them. But
So
once they know you and kind of love you and they know you
Yeah.
love them,
They don't look at it so harshly.
I think it is.
So this summary of healing process, how people heal from trauma, which takes place over time, it starts with helping people educate themselves about their trauma. And giving them freedom to talk about it is a good way to start with that. And learning about trauma and treatment approaches for trauma. But number 3 is really important: physical movement, breathing, and meditation practices. I want to focus on breathing for a minute, because people who suffer from trauma don't breathe. Now, I know they breathe to live, but they tend to hold their breath. And that creates not only health stuff, but it also it keeps them in a state of tension. It's important to breathe with your residents. Don't tell them to breathe. Breathe with them. Say, let's breathe for a minute. I need that as a person, to be able to calm myself, to be able to feel a little better, the breath coming in and out. It's so amazing that people stop breathing in all kinds of situations. We do it. Any kind of, and you probably stopped breathing when that door opened after the two examples I just gave, right? Your breath. We need to remind them to breathe a lot and do it with them, because I need to breathe. So the other night, last week my daughter was in a meltdown, and 11-year-old daughter, she was in a meltdown, and I said, when I say breathe, she usually says, I can't. So I said, let's breathe together. And I said, all right, here we go. In.
And that's bonding too.
Yeah, and
That's
we
bonding.
breathed, and she fell asleep during the breathing.
Aww.
And I was like, it was at night or
That's so
whatever,
cute.
but it's like, let's breathe
It's
together.
safe.
I'll breathe with you. And that was better than telling her to breathe.
Right.
But to me, I thought the two were the same, but they weren't the same. You get it? It's like it was different. So that's something you can do. If you notice someone agitated, say, let's do some breathing. I think it'll make us both feel a little better.
Yeah.
You're human too. You're not just staff. You're human first. Staff second. Let's breathe. Anyway, and then it's all part of that human connection. And people don't heal in a vacuum. They usually heal relationally. It's because they find people they can trust. They can find spaces that are safe with others. That's usually how people walk through the healing process. And they find some aspect of well-being, which I'm going to skip over that. And we're going to take a break. So we really come to start talking about stigma. Stigma has many layers in the world of addiction. Like there's stigma attached to addiction. Then there's stigma attached to treatment.
Absolutely.
And then there's stigma attached to medication-assisted treatment.
Bad.
So there's like these layers. So the folks who we're working with and sometimes are highly sensitive to all these different elements of stigma. Sometimes the helping professional is not aware of the stigma that they put on themselves. And so sometimes I think we think of stigma as being outside of ourselves, but stigma is also something we have to look in the mirror periodically and say, am I stigmatizing? Like what I talked about earlier about making recovery harder for the person I'm working with than I'm willing to do myself. You know, the using certain language that is negating or diminishing. Like where in the world of medicine would you talk about a urine being dirty? Like, what do you think of when you call somebody their urine dirty? You're clearly not talking about the actual composition of, it's an image and it's a feeling. Well, we know that their drug test, first of all, I don't even like to talk about, well, your urine was, I don't talk about other people's urine. You don't talk about my urine. I mean, it's like, let's think about this as
Lab
humans.
results.
Right.
Your lab results. Well, your drug test. Your test. Your lab test showed evidence of a particular substance in it. Let's talk about that. But when you say it's dirty, you've already put them in a class that you're not in, right? Although nobody took your drug test during the same time. I mean, it's like it puts someone under the type of a microscope that immediately spells shame. And kind of a top down. So I like to say, let's talk about what we saw in your drug test or your lab results. Lab results is good. Technically, it is a lab result. It showed evidence of, or traces of, or whatever, a particular substance. Let's talk about that. Referring to people as drug abusers. The word abusers. I mean, what do we use the word abusers for in society? People that, bad people.
Yeah.
Have you ever met an abuser that you didn't think was, you know what I mean? It's like, so stigma and our language kind of, we have to think through our language and whether we are speaking in a way that gives people the sense that they shouldn't feel shame about who they are or where they are. And just reverse it and say, how would I feel if it was that? Now, it gets kind of cloudy when you talk about the term addict. Like, I would never call someone an addict, but they sometimes, when they tell their story, they say, I'm an addict.
That's what I do.
Yeah, which is fine. But I'm never going to call you that because I feel that I'm making a judgment on you. If the way you tell your story, and we know this though in families, your family probably, but other people's families, you know how families can talk about each other in a certain way, and it's all cool. But if you talk about the family in that way, they're ready to all get up and slap you. So if someone says their sister is a narcissist or whatever, but if you call her sister a narcissist, she's gonna stand up and slap you, right? Yeah. So it's the recognizing that it's not our place to use that kind of a term, because that term is usually used derogatorily in society generally.
What would you use instead of that? In recovery, or?
I might say that in terms of calling someone out, I might say it's someone who has a substance use disorder.
Okay.
And it's, an SUD if people understood that, or a substance use disorder.
So even if I'm in recovery, talking to someone else who's in recovery.
I think it's different. I think I'm talking about, and this is challenging when you've been on both sides of the fence, so let's talk about that for a minute, because you're more comfortable with that term than I will be.
Right.
Because being on the professional side of it, I would never use the term addict to you.
It's hard to put that professional hat on sometimes.
So,
when you've been on both
so
sides.
you might weigh it a little different than I would, and that's okay. But I'm wanting you to think about it, to make sure that the way you communicate doesn't reinforce that stigma, a negative mark on someone when you're not
meaning it that way, right?
Yeah, because the idea is to join with people that we're both human, and you don't want to use language that makes you look good and them look bad. You look top, they look bottom. You look okay, they look not okay. You look professional, they look street. You don't want to create that kind of dynamic. It doesn't work good. It doesn't work well. So think through it. And I will say for that comment, I think people who are in recovery and walking the professional line have to think through how they do that. That's true to themselves, but if a person's looking at you as a professional, they might think differently than if they're looking at you as a peer.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
It's a slippery slope there.
Yeah, so think through it. And I don't have a problem saying it out loud what I'm thinking with patients or clients. It's like let's talk about this. Let me tell you why I don't use the word, kind of thing.
Right.
Why I'm never going to call your urine dirty. Now you might say in your story, well, I had a dirty urine. Well, you can say that if you want, but I'm not going to call your urine dirty.
I gotcha.
Because I wouldn't want somebody calling my urine dirty.
And we would prefer, while you're working at Tides, that you are very aware and kind of wearing the Tides hat, not the, not as you would say, the
Right. Yeah.
You might come to a place where you learn how to say it both ways. ways and acknowledge it. Say, look, if I was talking about myself in my recovery, I'd say, hi, I'm an addict. But when I talk as a TIDES professional, I want to make sure you know that I'm not that's not a word that I would use as a judge. That we understand that you have a substance use disorder, because that's where it is.
I think it's hard for me to remember sometimes that when these new ladies come in, they don't know me. They don't know that they don't know my history. They don't know my story. So if I come to them that way, I think they may, it's not the same.
Yep.
It's not the same.
Because you want to develop the rapport and the trust. And then you also want to be aware of your language. You want to do both. I'm not saying it like it's just easy. It's an art. This whole thing of building rapport and figuring out how you build rapport and maintain professionalism, how you bond but maintain a healthy boundary, is an art. It's not automatic. You have to work at it.
Yes.
And sometimes your coworkers might give you a little bit of feedback, and that's okay too. Recognize that it's an art to develop. It's a skill to work on. It won't be the same in a year from now that it is right now.
Right.
You'll keep growing and saying, I think I found a better way to do this.
Absolutely.
I found a better way to do that.
Right.
That's okay. Stigma is so huge, and it goes with the language. I give some examples here, which we really. I had a voicemail from a very high up official, I'll say, at the hospital, who said, Kenny, this is so and so in the emergency room. I've got a drug abuser or a drug addict here who's been back and forth to the emergency room 45 out of the last 60 days, wondering if you can do anything with him. Now, can you imagine the care that person was probably getting? Oh, horrible. If the person in charge of their care talks about them that way, and here's the thing I want to say about that. How do you talk about the residents when you're just talking amongst yourselves? You got to think about that too.
Big time.
Because it will carry over. Just like you are highly sensitive, probably in some ways, the residents are highly sensitive too. It'll carry over. Be careful not only what you say to them, but what you say about them. It impacts our body language. It just has an effect. We want to be the ones that don't do that. Like if you supposedly are maintaining professionalism with a person, but when you're a coworker, you say, those addicts, they all just lie all the time. Ooh. When I hear that, I don't feel like I'm in a safe place professionally. I feel like, if they don't like the people they're working with, they're not going to get good care. Okay, I understand that honesty is a big challenge as people walk into a healthier lifestyle, but we have that same struggle too. Let's not act like, I don't know how many lies everybody tells a day according to researchers, but we're not immune. So taking that kind of position, we need to think about how we communicate to each other.
I also like for our staff to be really, really ultra aware and sensitive to negativity. We may be having a real struggle with one particular woman, and no one's really hip on her right now and stuff like that. We don't really need to be sharing that information with each other. We don't need to be doing that. We need to be taking the high road and being optimistic about, well, I know she's really struggling with this right now, but we're really hoping that she'll turn a corner pretty soon, and let's just all see how we can help her kind of process through what she's going through, instead of just like, oh my God, she's driving me insane, that kind of thing.
But that can be a real human feeling. We have that human feeling. Your own children or your spouse or lover or parents can drive you insane, right? You can feel that.
Yes, you can feel it.
And so it's okay to be human, but we want to be very careful because you're in a professional environment where you want the communication to stay professional. That's the key. You can feel, and if someone drives you crazy, you might have to go into a room and shut the door and do some yelling into a pillow or whatever you do, but you want to come out professional.
Keep the positive both way, employee and
Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
that makes, and even our shift notes. You know, because when the next person reads our shift notes, if we're just like, oh my God,
That sets their
it
shit
does
up
set
on-
their tone.
Yeah.
So, you know, just everything.
So I'm going to tell you my journey in this came from some of this conversation we're having came from an orthopedic practice that asked me to come and help their staff. And I'm thinking, orthopedics? Yeah. They said, I said, what's the problem? And they said, well, people are coming to our front desk and they're belligerent, they're angry, and they're shouting, and we don't know how to handle them, and all of them are people who are on opioids, either street or medication opioids. I said, okay. So the first thing we did is we talked about crisis. I said, probably what's happening, first of all, is people are coming to your door in crisis. Let's talk about what a crisis is. Usually a person's in crisis. It's usually acute. Now, there are some people you might say, no, this person's always in crisis. But usually crises are because somebody, whatever tools they have to handle a situation, they don't feel they have those tools anymore. And they get to a sense of that they don't feel they have options because they don't have tools. So the essence of a crisis, and all of us can get to crises ourselves. Let's not act like we're just talking about the other. It's us too. A crisis is when we don't have tools, we don't have options, or we don't see the tools or the options that we have. And usually, we talked about this earlier, we're not breathing. We're holding our breath. So, and that just makes the crisis worse. So the first thing is to help people breathe and to remind people that they have options and to help them in that process. So if someone comes to me in a crisis, the first thing I'm going to want to do is sit down with them and make sure we have safe space. Say, let's talk about this. Say, has this ever happened before? Let's talk about how you handled it before. People forget things that worked before. I do. I forget stuff. And I'll go, yeah, I did that 2 years ago. We have to remind ourselves of things. So oftentimes the agitated client or the angry patient is just someone who's in crisis who needs someone to be able to sit down with them and just walk through it with them and talk about, has this ever happened before? No, yeah, this did happen before. Let's talk about how you handled it before. Did that work? That did, but I can't do that this time. Well, let's talk. Let's find some other options for you. When people feel they have options, their crisis goes down. Now, I'm also talking about this because of the safety concern. First safety is, are they at risk of harming themselves? And we should not be afraid to ask the question. If somebody's crisis is to the extent that we're concerned about that, we need to say, can I ask you a question? Are you having some thoughts about hurting yourself? You can use the suicide word or whatever you feel comfortable with, but are you having some thoughts about hurting yourself? Because if you are, I want to make sure that we get you the help that you need so that you stay safe. Because remember, your safety is our number one concern. I would always lean that way. The second is, also is self-preservation on our part, because when people feel desperate, they can also lash out. They can lash out physically. So de-escalating is good for everybody. It's good for us as the professional, it's good for the person, and ultimately it creates a safer environment. So being a staff that thinks about de-escalating, calm down, that doesn't work.
No.
Guess what? That increases tension. If it's in a group, sometimes somebody says, hey, come on, let's go talk. Get them out of the group. Some people, their agitation goes up when others are around. And they feel they have to go louder so that they stand above the group. them out of the group. Come, let's go talk. Let's talk about what's going on. I can tell that you're more agitated than usual. And you begin the process of what I would call crisis intervention or de-escalation. Very important skill and mindset to have as a staff person. Yes?
I think we've gotten angry calls before by cussing and everything like that. So I think that really comes a little bit challenging. But what I have done is like I don't really say anything besides kind of listen to them at first, and then I kind of ask them like further follow-up questions. And if they're still yelling and screaming, I'm like, I have to hang up right now because they're not able to listen to me, and also you're disrespecting me, and I can't have that. So you just hang up the phone.
And sometimes, especially with a phone call, you might have to do that. You can always add to that. Please feel free to call me when you get a chance to, if you can calm down, so we can have a better conversation. You can always say that because they may or may not hear that, but it lets them know that the door is not permanently closed. It's only closed now because of their behavior. And the door can be, that's why you should never say, never. You shouldn't say that in the behavioral health space that we work in. You shouldn't say that at home either, because you know you're going to go back on it. I'm never going to trust you again. You know, first of all, that makes no sense. That's the only time you should ever say that is someone you're never going to see again in your life. Because if you're going to see them again, you might have to trust them again, right? So try to avoid the never words as much as possible, but really leave the door open. But there's nothing wrong with setting that kind of clear boundary. I'm not going to have a conversation where we're not able to listen to each other and talk respectfully.
When you were talking about crisis intervention, is it when you were saying like asking them if they feel like they're going to harm themselves, is it okay to ask, especially in the setting when we feel like maybe the babies are in a situation that's not healthy? Like, how would we handle that?
Well, you certainly would ask the question.
About the baby?
Yeah,
Okay.
and you would ask, we want to make sure that you're safe and that your baby's safe too.
Okay.
Because when you're angry or heightened in anxiety, you do things you wouldn't normally do.
Right.
Everybody knows that. Humans know that. I mean, if you're angry, you might say something that you wouldn't say when you're not angry, right? In a situation. So we know that. It's human behavior. We're not talking to them like they're so different from us. It's, hey, we know that when you get angry or really agitated, that you might not pay attention to some things or do things differently. We want to make sure that your baby's okay. So that when you get to the other side, you're not regretting anything that happened. Yeah.
A couple of things. One thing that's really hard is when they're heightened, for us to stay neutral.
Oh yeah, stay calm.
Because we will just be like, now just calm down for a minute. You know, that's just not going to calm anybody down. And it can be really irritating for them when we are so calm, but that is still where we need to sit.
I'm sorry, I keep thinking about the movie Anger Management on the airplane. The scene on the airplane. Have you guys seen that? Where they set it up staged, but where the guy, the lady comes over and he Adam Sandler is the actor, and he asks for something and she doesn't give it to him, and he says, "Could I have that?" And she says, "You're gonna have to calm down." And he says, I am calm. And then they get the security guy, "Calm down, sir." And he said, "I am calm." And then he tases him with this
just
calm
keep
down
getting
war.
worse.
That's right.
Getting
Yeah,
worse,
so
yeah.
but yeah, you don't win a war by yelling "calm down" ever.
Right.
In any setting. In your family, it doesn't work, right? What happens when you yell "calm down" to someone close to you? They just get more agitated. Or
So
they
should we
accuse-
take ourselves out of this? Like, if they're obviously not, and if they're not really listening or hearing us when we're saying we're here to help, staying calm, doing all things,
Let's
do
take a
we-
break.
do we separate ourselves from them?
Sometimes it is a good thing to say, "Let's take a break and we'll come back to this."
Okay.
Let's each take a break. Let's take a couple minutes to just breathe on our own, get some space, and then let's come back and talk about this.
Okay.
That is always helpful because people usually come back calmer.
Right. Okay.
So the key thing is just to be aware that handling situations where there's a crisis or high agitation is part of the work, and the number one thing is to de-escalate and make sure and ensure safety. Yeah.
Sorry, this was my second piece.
Okay. Yeah. The second one.
You were talking about don't say never. The other one is always. Because when I can see where we might be talking with a woman and we're going, you're always upset about something. Or you're always overreacting. Or you're never cleaning your apartment. You never sign in and out. I mean, these are things that are simply not true. So easy to say.
Yeah,
But
those are bad
definitely
words. Good
things
point.
that we have to kind of pull ourselves back from and help each other. If we're like, not ever, you know.
That's good. Never
but yeah,
or
sorry.
always usually are
Yeah,
not
those are
really true.
no.
And they're extreme ways of talking, and they usually evoke an extreme response.
Yeah. That sends them into defense.
Like, you always interrupt me. Well, they don't always interrupt you, but once you say that, you're in a fight.
Right.
I said to my son the other day, I said, you never answer your phone. He was like, what are you talking about? Blah, blah, blah. I'm like, I shouldn't have said that.
That was
But
a good
it's
never
true
example.
though. It's true, but I
Here's
should
your
not have said that.
response.
Yeah.
I went last time.
Answer your phone.
You answer your phone 12% of the time. I'd like it to increase to 50%.
There we go.
Go on a little graph.
Reasonable goals.
Yeah. So, anyway, so it really leads us into this part that I'm kind of passionate about with customer service, because I experience good customer service and I love it, and I experience bad customer service and I never want to go back there. And because we can all relate to that, when someone treats you really good, what do you want? You want to go back. And if it's a waiter or waitress, you want to tip them really good. You know, it's like you appreciate when people give you kind of good attention. And you remember it negatively when people give you bad attention. And so I did a little bit of research on impressions, great first impressions in healthcare. And so this one has 13 of them, which of course, but I want you to see my top 5, which are the ones that are bolded. I don't know if you can see it, but here's my top 5. Number 5, smile. People do not walk into a place where they're seeking help and feel good when the person's frowning or looking at them like they're a problem. And I walked into an office the other day, healthcare office. What's your name? Rank and serial number? I mean, what do you want? Kenny? Date of birth? Didn't smile. What I wanted was, hey, how you doing? All right, let me make sure I got your stuff right. What's your name?
Like you knew them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
friendly.
but they knew you, yeah.
Smile. So smile is one. The second one is number 6, make eye contact. Someone who never looks at you. It doesn't feel good. In healthcare, we call it the 80-20 rule. And that is that when you're in a session, like as a therapist, I'm a licensed therapist, so if I'm in a session, 80% of the time I should be giving you eye contact. 20%, yeah, I can, if I'm documenting or doing whatever, it's okay to look away. But 80% of the time should be eye contact. People appreciate that. They feel it's more genuine, they feel more connected. Number 8, check the pronunciation of the person's name. Make sure you're saying it the way they like it. The way they like it. Because people love to hear their name the way they like it. For whatever, it's affirming, it's comforting. If I called you Gaby, is your full name Gabriella?
My middle name is Gabrielle, and I definitely hate not being called by my middle name. So I get it.
Yeah, I was saying that my daughter's middle name is Gabriella.
It's
So, and my middle name is Gabriel. So I'm all tight with them. But it's like pronounce the name the way. So what I do is I don't assume. I usually say, look, I want to make sure that I say your name the way you like it. Oh, call me Gabby. Okay, I'm gonna call you Gabby. So don't call me by my full name because you know it because you got my record. Don't call me the way I like. So ask someone how, and their last name too, if you have to. If you're
And your
using-
baby's name. That's
And
a
how to
big
spell
deal.
it. How to
Spell
spell
their
it.
baby's name
Yeah,
right
and how do
pronounce
you
it
like
right.
to hear it? It's about the hearing. How do you like to hear it? Oh, I like it this way. Okay, and then make it your mission to say it the way they like it. The fourth is to express gratitude for their visit, and in this setting, because it's not a visit, they're living here, express gratitude that they've hung in there. How many times do you say to a resident, to a woman, you know what, I just want to say I really appreciate the fact that you've stuck with this program. There are a lot of other places you could have gone and done things differently, and you decided to stay at Tides. I appreciate that. It tells me something about you.
Or that we're so proud of them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do. Yeah.
Regardless of what
Yeah.
step they're in, and if they just made a big mess, the day before.
But you're here, and you're still
Yeah.
here, and you came back, or you didn't leave.
Mhm.
You didn't walk away. And there are probably times when you thought about walking away and you didn't. I want you to know I really appreciate that.
Or when you have corrected them about something like, cleaning their house or whatever, and then you see the change,
And they handled it.
and then you
I
say
really
to them,
appreciate
this,
that.
you're really doing a good job.
Express gratitude. People love when gratitude is expressed towards something about them.
Mm-hmm.
You should do that with each other. But
Yeah, and we all do. We all want gratitude.
that's right. This is human. This is not rocket science, folks. This is taking what we like anyway
Mm-hmm.
and applying it in the workplace to each other and to the people we're working with. My next one, I'll talk about how to apply this. Number 13, walk with your guests. So this orthopedic practice, back to my story. So this orthopedic practice, so the orthopedist would see the patient, and usually what would happen is the follow-up would involve physical therapy. And I said, what's the biggest problem with your orthopedic patients? And the staff all said, they won't go to physical therapy. They just want the orthopedist intervention, whatever it is, a steroid shot or whatever. They won't go to physical therapy. I said, wow, that sounds really bad. How far away is physical therapy? When you drive there, is it hard to get an appointment? I said, no, it's right down the hall here in the same building. And I said, okay, so walk me through how you tell them about their physical therapy. Well, when they leave the orthopedic office on the left side of the building, we tell them to walk to the right side of the building, go through the glass door, and make an appointment. 80% of them don't do that. They walk out because guess what? They don't want to do that. They're not connected to physical therapy. According to what they thought, they probably got what they needed. They don't know whether they believe in physical therapy. And I said, have you ever thought about this? How about the person, instead of telling them where the door is, walk with them, open the door for them, walk into physical therapy with them, introduce them to someone in physical therapy, and have them make the appointment with you. Walk with your guest. Treat them that way. Have you ever had somebody treat you that way when you're at a place and you were lost or didn't know where to go? Instead of when they just point, if they said, come here, I'll show you where to go. It feels so good, and you get immediately connected. So now you've met someone in physical therapy, you're now connected to them, and this person basically gave you what we would call a warm handoff. And I believe very strongly that that's one of the key missing pieces in healthcare, is that people don't get warm handoffs. They get referrals, which is a piece of paper or a name and a telephone number. They don't know that person. They got a busy life anyway. Sometimes they got a chaotic life, and it's the last thing in the world they're going to do. But when you meet someone and they connect with you and they say, "Oh, I can't wait to work with you. We're going to do this," and all of a sudden you have an obligation. You have someone that you feel warm towards, and there's a greater chance of connecting and getting to the next step, which produces success in the realm of orthopedics. It produces success in the realm of behavioral health that we work in. That's our space. So, walk with your guests. My really cool experience with that was a negative experience where I asked them why they couldn't do that. They said, "We don't have time to do that." I said, "You don't have time? How long does it take?" They said, it's about a 30-second walk, and it would take about a minute to do that. I said, if you don't have time for that, then you don't have time for success for your patients. So make up your mind. What do you want? Do you want that minute to yourself, or do you want the success of your patients? Rearrange your stuff to make it work, is what I basically left them with. I have no idea what they've done with it. Hopefully they took it to heart. My great experience with that was at the hospital. And sometimes people have bad experiences or good experiences at the hospital. I get it. This was before it became Novant, so I can't speak to Novantness. But I can tell you that I was walking down the hallway with a senior official at the hospital, going to meet with like the assistant director of the hospital. We were working on a plan to co-locate a therapist there at the hospital. And this guy was walking me down the hall. We were about halfway there. You know, the hospital has long halls. So we'd been walking for about 5 minutes already, right? And there was a woman walking the other direction against us, obviously confused. She was kind of looking around, wondering where. She was a Latina. She didn't speak very good English. So she, this guy stopped her and said, "Do you need some help?" And she kind of pointed to her appointment and, not sure where to go. And he just said to her, and I know a little bit, I can speak a little bit of Spanish, and I spoke with her, and he figured out exactly where she needs to be. And he turned around, and we walked with me, and we walked her down another 2 long halls to find a place, and he dropped her off where she needed to be. And then he turned around with me, made us late for the appointment with the assistant director. And I'll never forget how impressed I was that he took the time for one woman who was lost in the hospital with an appointment, not knowing where to go, and walked her until she got to the place she needed to be. I was so impressed with that. I can tell you that vision and the experience of all that walking will never leave me the same. It was very powerful. And that's the kind of atmosphere we want to have with a warm handoff. So the preventing of escalation really comes down to the same things that build rapport with our patients or our residents. Welcoming, we're glad you're here, we're glad you stuck it out. Respecting, I'm listening. The 80-20 rule of eye contact. Appreciating, thanks. I really appreciate that you're still here, that you went through a tough time and you stuck it out. Connecting, that's the warm handoff. Don't give people pieces of paper with numbers and people to call that they don't know. They don't know them. They're probably not going to contact them. If you really think it'll be helpful to them, at best, at the very least, sit down with the phone and say, "I'll call them together with you. Let's call them together and talk to them." "Hi, John, I've got Susie here and over at Tides, and we are looking at her needing this. Can we set something up?" "Sure, I'll let her talk with you," and I stay there and I let that be a warm handoff, even if it's by the phone. Joining, rather than "this is what you need to work on," say "let's work on this." Joining with the person, and then assuring them, "I'm going to stick with you the whole way. We're going to make sure you get through this safely." So I was doing this workshop at the Addiction Professionals of North Carolina conference this past fall, and this guy said to me when I did the workshop, he said, "You know what I say, Kenny?" I don't even know his name, but I said, "I'm going to quote you every time I present this." He said, "I say I want to be the best part of someone's worst day." And
That's
I said,
awesome.
"That is amazing. I love that," right? I say, wow, if I thought about that every time I met someone, I would be a better person. Let alone how that other person would experience it, right? I would be a better person. And so he's now memorialized, whoever that guy is, in my workshop who said that. I told him, I'm going to quote you every time I talk about this. I want to be the best part of someone's worst day. And then one of our heroes, Maya Angelou, we did what we knew, and when we knew better, we did better. And that is, that's our session.
Phenomenal.
So,
Wonderful.
Thank you guys are doing great. Any questions or comments of things that you want to bring out?
Yeah, now's the time.
I could probably think of 500.
I'm just gonna circle back to stigma really quick.
Yes, stigma.
One like dream of mine in the recovery circle outside here is that we'll get over needing to use labels. Like, why can't we just say, you know, and maybe in a 12-step environment, you know, hello, I'm so and so. Why the label?
Instead
We
of-
don't say
yeah.
like, we don't walk around and say I'm diabetic or I'm whatever.
Right. I'm
Can
diabetic
we
Kenny.
get past that? That's my dream. Is that
That would
because you
be
hear people, and it's so deprecating. You hear people say, "I'm a drunk." Well, you've been sober 35 years. Why are you saying that about yourself? I
right.
mean, do you not hear the, you know, and maybe it's just habit, but I think and in the mental health community too, like there's so much stigma. We're working on that, right? But the lower it becomes, the more people will be seeking treatment,
Right.
and the labels can kind of be less of a thing.
Like I
You know.
would like to say, oh, here's my friend Gabby, who I call her anxious Gabby because she suffers from anxiety. You know, I mean, you just don't do that. You identify by the diagnosis.
Yeah.
We don't introduce people that way. So we want to try to keep moving towards a destigmatized environment. But I do stay away from telling people what they can say about themselves because that's really their own space. You know.
I think it's really hard when I hear people coming so harshly on Matt.
Yeah,
Because-
medication
because
assisted
of
treatment, right?
Whoever they knew didn't work for
They
them.
know, everybody knows someone
Correct.
who didn't do it right.
Correct. But that could be for everything in life. And it's
Yes.
frustrating because a lot of those people make people stray away from getting help. And Matt is one of the things that helped me the most.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's frustrating because people almost sometimes are ashamed to say that they're, you know, getting help on maintenance, whatever. And I really try to help these ladies understand that there is nothing shameful about it at all.
Right.
At all.
Well, they don't understand the physiology that we talked about, where it's actually a normalizing medicine when it's used properly,
Right.
and it's not a drug replacing one drug for another. It doesn't operate that way. But people don't understand that, and everyone has experience of somebody who did it wrong, and so they
course.
focus on that. You don't know how many times people would call me and say, you know, this person is nodding out in group, blah, blah, blah. They never ask, did they get enough sleep? Did they get a
That's right.
healthy diet? All of those things contribute.
Do they have a young baby?
You know what? They never ask all the questions.
Right.
Now, it could be that their medication needs to be adjusted. That's possible.
Mhm.
There are situations where people's medication needs to be adjusted. By the way, that happens in every stage of every
Absolutely.
illness that requires medication.
Mhm.
There are things that sometimes someone does better or worse and has to be adjusted and that. I can live with that. That's okay. Let's take a look at whether they're metabolizing their medicine properly and whether we need to make an adjustment. But we don't ask the other questions, you know, that are just as valid. A lot of times people aren't able to participate well in group because they're not sleeping or eating well, and they're not
But they have
breathing.
anxiety. here. They have a lot of
Yeah,
things.
there's all kinds of reasons. So understanding people as people and not really labeling them just in specific little pigeonholes helps us treat them in a way that they feel more human. They feel that they're in a safer human environment. Very important. Good point. Anything else? I'm here as long as the donuts don't run out.
Then you're gone.
Right.
Right
I
off
think
into
you
the
still have a
sunset.
French toast one over here with your name on it.
All right.
Well, we finished up a little early, so you guys are free to go.